So I'll call this meeting to order. Ms. Robinson, would you do the roll call, please?
Mayor Walker,
Present.
Vice Mayor McGill,
Here.
Councillor Hill,
Here.
Councillor Payne,
Here.
and Councillor Snook.
Here.
All right, thank you. We just have one item for business before we get started with the joint session with the PCRB. The first item up for us is a resolution for CARES funding allocation for emergency assistant program, the Pathway Fund, $150,000. And this is one reading because we've already previously voted on the CARES funding, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Boyles.
Thank you, Mayor Walker. Yes, as you said, we are asking your approval to transfer $150,000 of previously appropriated CARES money from the public safety police department salaries where it was originally appropriated and transfer it to our emergency assistance program. At this point, we are not running low, but Taki, please correct me, but we're out of funding to continue to help affordable housing assistance. And we would like to use this money to just bridge the gap before the ARP money begins sometime in May. My understanding is that our pathway staff have been continuing to take applications, but we're unable to fund any of the applications until this appropriation can be approved. Taki, we'll let you provide any details.
Well, I think you've covered it all, sir. We are running at request somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 a week at this point. We anticipate that will gradually reduce over the course of the year, but at this point we have a tremendous number of folks who are in need, and with accumulative expenses that they've been unable to meet for many months. And so this money will go immediately to put to good use as we await the ARP money sometime soon. And we appreciate your consideration of moving this money into the emergency hotline.
And Mayor and Council, we do anticipate around mid-May is when we should start to see the ARP funds coming in.
Okay.
May 12th is supposed to be the date.
Okay. But then, so is this enough? Because that still will require 2 readings from us, correct? And so we are about June. So Kaki, this will carry the Pathway Fund through that time. Right.
This should. We may be in a position where we have a couple of days where we're accepting applications and processing requests, but not cutting the checks right away as we await the final funding from that. So this should get us there. We are changing some of our, together with Albemarle, changing some of our expectations around funding with a concentration of funding rent and utilities, and limiting that to $1,000 a month. It had been as high as $1,500 during the peak of the epidemic or the pandemic, excuse me. And in order for us to sustain our assistance, I think we've agreed collectively to reduce that to $1,000 a month and to focus on utilities and rent. There's always this consideration about whether we fund as many of the needs as possible on the first day of the week and then run out of money by the end of the week, or whether we try to limit what we're providing so that we can provide a little bit of assistance to everybody. And sadly, there's not enough to meet all of the need. And so our focus has been trying to provide a meaningful amount of assistance to as many people as we can.
I know we've had this conversation before. And I'm still, I understand, but I'm still concerned, and this, we don't have to have the discussion now, but counselors, as we move into the new federal funding allocations and what we do with those, because if you're talking about average rents for the area being more than that $1,000, and if families can't come up with the difference, then we're not really fulfilling, the full need. And so, the up to 1,500, but meeting at least a 1 month rent requirement, I think that is something that we should, figure out how to do. And I understand if it's a joint partnership with, communications with the county, but I still think that we need to, if we can help someone for the full month without them having to figure out the rest. I know something's better than nothing, but that just usually doesn't always work out for everyone to be able to come up with the difference. And so I know there's been a lot of communications about budget and filling the gaps, but I think we need to look at this and the needs that people may have, when we are allocating those new dollars.
Mayor and Council, too, if I could remind everybody, and we haven't, as everybody knows, we're waiting to see the details of the new ARP money. In addition to the ARP money that we'll be receiving as a local government, there's also funding that will be for rent relief programs. We don't know how that's going to come through yet. So in addition to our own money, there should be some additional monies available strictly for that purpose as well.
All right, thank you. Councilors, are there any other questions, comments? No. All right. Okay, is there a motion?
I move we adopt a resolution for the Coronavirus Aid Relief and Economic Act CARES funds for Emergency Assistance Program, the Pathways Fund, at $150,000.
Second.
Any discussion? All right, Ms. Robinson.
Yes. Mayor Walker,
Yes.
Vice Mayor McGill,
Yes.
Counselor Hill,
Yes.
Counselor Payne,
Yes.
and Counselor Snook.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That carries 5-0. So thanks for working on that, and thanks, Kaki and Chip, for Mr. Boyles for getting it done. All right, thank you. Kaki, you're welcome to stay. Have a good evening. All right. Chair Brown, are you all good to go?
Mr. Wheeler, is the 434 number, is that Mr. Mendez?
That is Miss Gilmore, and I've
Okay.
just activated her mic.
Okay, very well.
You just need-
Go ahead, sorry.
You need a few more minutes.
He's in the process of logging in. Yeah, I guess if we can go till 5:15 or so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hey, Mr. Brown, James Watson's here. I'm here.
Thank you, good sir.
Looks like another phone number did join us.
Mr. Wheeler, would you happen to know if that's Mr. Mendez?
I do not, but he should be speaking shortly.
Okay.
Yeah, it's me, Bellamy.
Okay, very well. So I call this PCRB meeting to order. Ms. Robinson, would you take a roll call, please?
Yes. Vice Mayor Brown, I'm sorry, excuse me, Chairman Brown.
Here.
Sorry about that. Let me get to my list here. Don't want to make any more errors. Vice Chair Mendez,
Here.
Ms. Carpenter,
Present.
Mr. Frazier,
Present.
Ms. Gilmore,
Here.
Mr. C?
He was here.
Okay, Mr. C still here? All right, I'll move on to Mr. Watson.
Here.
Okay.
Okay, we do have quorum. Am I talking? Yes, we do have quorum, and I believe Mr. C will pop back up at some point. So the purpose of, from the PCRB's perspective of this meeting is to have a formal discussion with City Council regarding the upcoming ordinance, and to move the process along for the public's sake, to really get to that, ideally July 1 timeframe. And with that, I will turn it over to Vice Chair Mendez, because he will be leading this discussion. And I do want to personally thank him publicly because he has demonstrated excellent leadership in connecting with the public throughout this process to making sure that we have a lot of input in it. So Mr. Mendez, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. I can't see the PowerPoint presentation, but if you could put that up, that would be great.
So it's in process. I'll let you know when it's up.
Mr. Brown, is that something you're sharing?
Oh, does that?
I don't have any PowerPoint.
Okay. Let me go and find that. Let's see.
Yeah, it was in the package, but it's only one part of the package.
Okay, let's go. Hold on.
While you all figure that out, I would just like to welcome you all and thank you for working on this. I know that, it's been a very challenging conversations. I don't expect that will be different this conversation, and I think that's healthy. I really do think that, if it were easy, then we all would be doing something else. And so I just hope that everyone just keeps that in mind as we're having the discussion, be open-minded, and let's, do what's best for, what's best for the community. And again, thank you all for your effort.
Thank you for that, Mayor Walker. Let's see, go back here. Mr. Wheeler, do you know how I would go about?
I can pull it up now. If it's just that PDF in the packet.
Yes, sir. That's
Yeah.
we're going to start on. It should be right after the City Council's business. That next page, Charlottesville Police Civilian Review.
Okay, just a moment. Almost there. Can you see me now?
There it is.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Mendez, the presentation is live.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you all on the council and Mayor Walker for inviting us to come. Appreciate this opportunity. I'm trying to keep my presentation short, relatively short, but it is a little bit complicated in some aspects. I want to go to the next slide, which is called Overview.
We're there.
This basically just shows the elements that I intend to present here. The history of police oversight in the city to the extent that I was able to reconstruct it. how we went about developing our oversight model, and what the main elements of the model are. And I have one slide on resource considerations because those are, I think, going to be fairly important in terms of how we develop our model going forward, and then current status and next steps. I also have at the end of this presentation, 6 more slides dealing with the specific questions that the city manager asked in an email he sent to us last week. So we can sort of break the presentation down into two pieces. I think that's the way the schedule is set up. So if we want to go on to history here.
Okay.
Okay. So before 2017, there was actually a police civilian advisory board. I was not able to reconstruct from the historical records when it was actually implemented, but I have heard from people who have lived in the town for a while that it was there at least through the 1990s. It's purely an advisory board reporting to the police chief, not a review, and no really strong power. Like most movements to start a civilian review or a civilian police oversight, there was a triggering episode here that really lent a lot of impetus, which was obviously the Unite the Right rally in August of 2017, which mobilized public opinion and served as sort of a rallying cause for social justice and police oversight. The City Council passed a resolution in December of that year authorizing the formation of the initial Civilian Review Board. They were empowered to develop a framework for police oversight. And it also dissolved the existing advisory board. The initial board of 8 members conducted a lot of research and public outreach and issued initial proposals for enabling ordinance and bylaws in August of 2019. And I'd like to say that their research and the wonderful documentation that they left has been a real plus for this board. It's kind of like, standing on the shoulders of giants. The initial board powers were limited by the fact that there was no enabling legislation at the state level for a powerful civilian oversight organization, Dillon Rule or Home Rule. And the City Council adopted a version of the ordinance and bylaws that was considerably different from the initial board recommendations, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But be that as it may, the current CRB was appointed in February of last year, just in time for COVID, as it were. We have been Zoom meeting since June. We've elected officers, getting trained, developing procedures for receiving, tracking, and reviewing complaints, and holding hearings under our current framework. Our all-volunteer board has been operating without an executive director since it was founded, and that has made our life a little difficult, as you can imagine. One of the first acts of the board was passing a resolution asking the City Council to go back to the initial ordinance, to the initial board's ordinance and bylaw instead of the 2019 version that the council passed. COVID has made community engagement activities particularly difficult. And this is one area in which we hope to improve substantially. The world changed a little bit in October 2020. The governor signed an amendment to Virginia Code Section 9.1507 and 15.21507, and adding 9.1601, which enabled municipalities to form oversight organizations with much more extensive powers. The board formed the ordinance work group, a ordinance work group in December, and we've been working since then to develop an ordinance and operating procedures consistent with 9.1601. Next, please. So I went back and looked at the 2019 ordinance. This is that Charlottesville did not adopt. A lot of stuff was taken out of the initial recommendations. The model imposed by the 2000 ordinance was basically limited review and advisory function. Paid staff was 1 instead of 2. The public hiring provisions in staff, public participation provisions for staff hiring and board member selection were kind of stripped out, and I sort of understand why that is, but we will go on. It also reduced the diversity requirements for the board membership, taking the number of folks from disproportionately policed groups down from 4 to 3. The board stipend was eliminated. And board members could be removed without cause. It includes an opt-out provision so that the board will not necessarily get to see all complaints. So we'll talk about that a lot in a while. The board could take no action on complaints until after an internal affairs investigation is complete. And we're not allowed to investigate complaints or incidents and absolutely denied input into disciplinary decisions. And finally, actually, what is probably as important as anything else is that the audit function was removed. And I have a slide on audit function later, which we can talk about more. So we can go on to the next slide, please, bottom line. Our view of the existing model embodied in the 2019 ordinance and bylaws is that it leaves the complaint investigation opaque and totally closed to the public, and almost completely closed to board except under very limited circumstances. The board can't take any action on most complaints, cannot act independently, even in response to serious incidents, unless somebody makes a complaint and then it's investigated and then they ask for a review, and that process can be very lengthy. We can't initiate independent investigations of anything. We have no input into disciplinary or corrective actions. The executive director is the only person who's allowed to interact with the Charlottesville Police Department during complaint review. The board can consult only on a limited range of it, consult outside counsel only on a limited range of issues, and the power to access information is, in my opinion, pretty limited. We move on to the next slide, please. So rather than using all the section numbers, I'm calling it, and actually it was Senate Bill 5055. So you'll hear that, which refers to the actual section 9.1601. Was signed by Governor Northam on October 28th of last year. We pulled together an ordinance work group on 12/20, asking for volunteers from among the people who are attending our meetings and who had expressed input through emails and other chains. And we, our group, our little group includes Harold Foley, representing the People's Coalition, several members of the initial board, and Janice Redinger, who's a Charlottesville lawyer. and other people have provided some input as well. Kate Fraley, of course, don't want to forget. What we set out to do was do background research on oversight models. What were the initial CRB recommendations? We also looked at literature from NACOL and other organizations, and looked at oversight structures across the U.S. And then we set out to design an oversight model consistent with the new legislation. And if we go on to the next slide, major provisions. The next two slides, just I'll go through very quickly. They just show the specific powers that are given in Section 9.1601 of the recent legislation. So we can receive, investigate, and issue findings. And the question, of course, is, can we receive all complaints? Well, we believe we should be able to. Investigate and issue findings on incidents. So what that means, as far as we're concerned, is that if there is a serious occurrence, as outlined in this paragraph, the board doesn't need to wait for somebody to complain about it, which we think is very useful. And again, the big $64,000 question is the third point: to make binding disciplinary determinations in cases that involve serious breaches of departmental and professional standards. I didn't put in this for the sake of brevity, that it also requires us to consult with the chief of police and or the supervisor of an officer charged with misconduct before implementing any disciplinary action. But I'm hoping very much that consultation will be fruitful and not us just imposing our will. On to the next slide. Continue. To investigate policies, practices, and procedures. And again, this I think we have interpreted to be let's have an audit function, access to police outcomes, internal affairs documents, and to the ability to make recommendations, that is public reports regarding the results of our audit. To review investigations is pretty much the same as in our ordinance right now. A new thing is requesting reports of annual expenditures and making budgetary recommendations. That specifically in the new legislation is a power that was not. No one thought of it in any of the previous oversight structures for this city. Again, we have the same obligation to make public reports. And then there's like the 10th Amendment to undertake any other duties as reasonably necessary. So far, we haven't, our model, as we'll see, doesn't break any new ground based on this clause. It kind of sticks pretty closely to what's in the legislation. Next slide. Major. If you remember the first line of this slide, you kind of got what we're asking for. Complaint review, the ability to independently investigate, the ability to do in-depth audits, and the ability to make recommendations related to policies and procedures. Broken this down a little more into, we need to be able to receive complaints and process them, initiate independent investigations when the board thinks it's necessary, review internal affairs investigations that are not in the category of serious. Again, there are lots of ways of doing review and doing investigation, and we can, there is by no means unanimity within our work group as to what the best way to go is. Hold hearings, conduct periodic audits, and report frequently on those audits, and conduct structured, frequent public engagement activity. Now, and one thing that is not in that slide was exercise disciplinary authority. That was one of the That was one of the questions that the city manager asked. So I have another slide later at the end, the second half of the presentation. We can talk about that in more detail. We'll go on to the next slide, please. We think we need to receive all complaints. The current structure, the current complaint form allows the plaintiff to check a box to opt out. And this means that the board is never going to get a clear picture of all the complaints that are received by the Charlottesville Police Department. We would also need to identify, we need to see all those complaints in order to identify those that are serious enough to merit an independent investigation. And what we put in the ordinance is we will work cooperatively with the Charlottesville Police Department to receive complaints and maintain confidentiality of information elements where that is required by law. The next slide. Independent investigation. We think this is a pretty important function. We believe the board should have the authority to initiate serious incidents and complaints of serious misconduct. And again, if it's going to be a complaint of serious misconduct, that means we need to see it if we're going to decide whether we're going to investigate it or not. Investigation, by the way, is a prerequisite for exercising disciplinary authority. The current ordinance calls for having an investigation committee and for defining criteria for initiating investigations in the board's operating procedures. We've received some feedback from our work group folks about how big this committee should be, how open it should be in its function. And I think the leaning now is toward a rotating committee among all the board members. The investigation, when the current ordinance states that when the board decides to do an independent investigation, we will do it based on the evidence that's provided by internal affairs, assuming they have started their investigation or started to gather information. We would expect them to share that with us or share that with our investigator, who will be independent, qualified, and bound to confidentiality. The board, we can hold hearings under the ordinance for a number of reasons, including in support of an investigation. But we are not required to do that. We could make findings of fact without necessarily holding a hearing. That's different from the appeals process, which requires a hearing. Now, my initial thought was that independent investigations would be rare because the potential misconduct that would rise to the level of requiring an independent investigation, taking entirely out of the hands of the police department, would not occur very frequently, and that's based on only a year or two's experience. But members of our task force have pointed out, the task group, our work group, have pointed out that it sure would be a lot easier if the board, just as a policy, investigated everything, all complete. Now that has all kinds of resource implications and information implications, and we're still working on it. Next slide, please. The reviewing of internal affairs investigations, which is, again, very much like in the 2019 ordinance. The difference here is that the review process would be backed up by an audit function. So if we decide only to investigate a small percentage of complaints, then the non-serious complaints will go through IA. And it will, then the review process will occur exactly as it does now. It will require the receipt of a review request. And the information provided by the Charlottesville Police Department will be exactly the same. The board will hold a hearing just as required now. And our only authority in this, at this point, is to, concur, disagree, or find that the investigation is incomplete or unsatisfactory. And again, if we adopt this structure, the power of the board in non-serious complaints will be limited to auditing the outcome of IA investigation. Next slide, please. The board would be authorized to hold hearings under four circumstances: in support of complaints review, as is enabled now, in support of independent investigations, in support of disciplinary actions, or other matters where information gathering is necessary. We're developing the procedures now, depending on the purpose of the hearing. The exact procedures are going to vary. We're looking at best practices from many oversight organizations. Board may, as a matter of course, hearings will be public unless dealing with confidential matters, in which case they would be closed in conformance to the existing Charlottesville code, I believe. And subpoena power comes into play when there's hearing. So again, the thing we have to do now is define what a good faith effort is, and then invoke that when we believe that we're not getting sufficient information. In the hearings, the police officers, we're cognizant of the Police Officers' Bill of Rights. We're cognizant of the Law Enforcement Officers Procedural Guarantees Act, which is partially or completely superseded by new legislation. But we would want to preserve all of those protections to the extent possible. What's built into the ordinance now is that an officer will be told in advance what the alleged misconduct is and what and he or she will be allowed to be represented by legal counsel and to make statements before a disciplinary hearing or a disciplinary investigation, but he or she will not be required to make any statement. Next slide. As I said, one of the things I did going back in writing this new ordinance was looking closely at what the initial board has done, and I was very impressed by the audit feature that was many of the issues related to transparency and openness can be solved by an auditor. You know, we don't need to use a hammer of, you know, investigations or subpoenas. But if we have an auditor with empowered to, you know, report on trends in activities, investigations, and outcomes, and to maintain information access channels, we, you know, think that this would be a very, very important, you know, addition to the board's powers. And given the workload considerations, it would appear that having a full-time auditor would be advisable. So the new draft, the ordinance has a hiring procedure for the executive director and a hiring procedure that would allow the engagement of an auditor as well. Next slide. You know, public engagement is something that has, I think, been a weak point in the board, particularly in the case of because of COVID. But we have reinstated some things from the initial board recommendations would require us to hold quarterly public listening session to hear and report on community concerns. We would be allowed and we would seek out ways to facilitate communication between the community and the Charlottesville Police Department, including joint appearances and meetings. And we would be sure to provide periodic reports, perhaps even quarterly, on the concerns that we've identified, so that everybody knows that they've been registered. The police will hear about them, and the public will hear about them. And as I said, discipline is another important factor in our structure, but that's in a later slide. Next slide, please. So I take just a moment to talk about resources. Again, you know, the research indicates that budgetary allocations for oversight organizations vary widely, and it's really very much dependent on the model, how many people you have in your police organization, how many people you have in the municipality, what the workload is, and what your type of model is. What is the role or the duties of your oversight organization? Advisory and review models in which oversight organizations can only advise or only engage in complaint review are generally the least expensive, and that is the sort of the model of 2019. Investigation and audit models are, of course, more expensive because you know, more manpower is required, and staff compensation is generally the major cost element. Now, there are some considerations that affect, you know, resource level, potential resource levels for Charlottesville. In the first place, we're not a big city. So in the worst circumstances, the number of complaints is relatively low compared to big cities. Second, the board performs other functions in addition to complaint review. And I put that point in there because I could easily see an executive director spending almost full time on, you know, public engagement and to be supported by an auditor. Another thing that I learned in, you know, my year or so experience on the board is that we are a volunteer board. Most of us are employed and busy and/or have small children at home, and so there needs to be adequate staff support if we're going to move So as I say, the suggested, the ordinance suggests a full-time executive director and a police auditor as well, both being full-time positions. The next slide. Getting pretty close to the end here. We worked on this, we've completed this draft ordinance. We are starting to work on operating procedures based on the draft ordinance. We have provided to you in our packet a set of interim hearing procedures. And in the meantime, we are trying our best to operate under the 2019 framework, which is, very frankly, doesn't give us a lot of power. The next steps are to receive feedback from you, the board members in the community on the ordinance and on this model. To present, I think we'll be able to present a revised ordinance to the full board at our May 13th meeting. And then after that, it will be in your court. We will continue working on the operating procedures document, and with luck, we may be able to get something to you for our June meeting. So, one more slide for this part of the meeting here. I really do have to acknowledge the people who, participated in the ordinance development process, and other aspects of the PCRB functioning. Chairman Bellamy, the Pioneer Chairman, James Watson, and the other COB members in particular, Sarah Burke, Katrina Turner, Gloria Beard, and I left out Guillermo Uvila, who did a tremendous amount of research, members of the initial board, Harold Foley, Kay Fraley, Maisie Osteen, Janice Rediger, and Lisa Robertson, the acting city attorney, who has been a real trooper in terms of helping us pull together this draft ordinance. So that's the end of this part of the presentation. I think we're scheduled for comments or questions at this point.
Thank you for that. Before the comments and question part, we have just so we can factor in public comments too, that we have public comments right after, but I'll ask if there are any pressing questions from counselors. Okay, so we'll open.
So are we doing, I'm sorry. I mean, I have them, but they're all written down.
I didn't hear you. You were going in and out.
Apologize. I have questions, but I can wait after public comment. I've written them all down.
Okay. All right. So Mr. Wheeler, turn it over to you.
And Mayor Walker, is your preference to spend up to 15 minutes at
Let's
this point?
just see how many individuals would like to speak, because that would only give us 5. Let's just see what what the numbers look like, and then we'll.
Great. If you're in the audience and you'd like to speak to the PCRB and City Council, click the raise hand icon in the Zoom webinar. You can also press *9 if you're on via telephone. If you're watching on Facebook or Boxcast, come join us on Zoom by going to charlottesville.gov/Zoom. You can register and get a link to the meeting and join us. Each speaker will get up to 3 minutes, and please tell us your full name and where you're from. First up is Sean McGowan, who will be followed by Kate Fraley. Sean, you're on. Go ahead. Sean, can you hear us?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
We can.
Good. Outstanding. My name is Sean McGowan, members of the board and council. I am the division director for the Virginia Police Benevolent Association. We represent over 7,000 members across the state of Virginia, 60,000, more than 60,000 in the Southeast United States. In Charlottesville, we do represent 90% of the officers working there. What was glaring to me under feedback on the slides that we're going through last time was that everybody's being included in this discussion except for the officers whose boots are on the ground, working those beats, keeping the public safe there in Charlottesville. We would like to be involved in this discussion. We hope that we will be included in the discussion. Professionalism, transparency, and improving the profession is certainly our goal. It's a common goal we share with you and the board. We want to be involved, and we certainly hope that we will be brought to the table so that some of these issues can be discussed with representatives who are representing those men and women, those fine men and women who are working on your streets.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up will be Kate Fraley, followed by Sarah Burke. Kate, you're on with council on the PCRB. Go ahead.
Okay, hi, everybody. It's great that everybody's talking. I just want to say that I support the part, and I'm speaking on behalf of the People's Coalition as well as myself, that the budget part is included in the, duties and powers. It's line 87. To request reports of the annual expenditures of the police department and to make budgetary recommendations to the city council concerning future appropriations. It's also in section 2-463. The board receives, but wait a second. You have lots of pieces of paper and so do I. Yeah, section 2463, request annual reports of police expenditures is the title. And I'm very supportive of the PCRB knowing about what the budget is and having some recommendation responsibilities about the police budget and getting it in a very fine itemized way. That's all.
Thank you. And next up is Sarah Burke, who will be followed by Jeff Fogel. Sarah, you're on with the PCRB and council. Go ahead.
Hey everyone, good evening. Thanks for that presentation, Bill, and for everybody getting together to talk about this. I want to focus a bit on the investigative element that Bill raised, and I want to focus on the importance of having an investigative power for the CRB, but I disagree that they should only investigate serious conduct. I don't think police should be investigating their own conduct. From the last look that I could see at the budget, internal investigations is somewhere within a $2.7 million category, which includes the chief's salary, her assistant, and the professional standards unit, which includes the internal affairs investigations. That's a large chunk of money. And when a police officer is accused of wrongdoing, I think that an independent investigator overseen by the PCRB should conduct the investigation every time. That investigator could be the executive director, which would save y'all some money, or it could be a contracted investigator that person has on retainer or that they contract out that work. The new state law allows these independent investigations and also to use subpoena power if necessary to ensure that they have access to all the data, documents, and witnesses that they need. So I encourage you to give the PCRB this full authority, which is already outlined by the state statute. And I also want to encourage the PCRB to independently investigate as many cases as possible to end the practice of police investigating their fellow officers' alleged misconduct. Of course, the PCRB would not have disciplinary authority in every independent investigation, only in these serious cases of misconduct. But I propose that all complaints should go to the PCRB and the executive director, and that they are able to investigate any complaint, not just some small subset. So I think of this as a way of sort of solving a problem rather than creating a policy that might not solve any problem. We know that police officers often exonerate their coworkers' conduct. If you look at the initial statement of George Floyd's murder, the city put out a statement that the death was ruled to have been a medical incident. It was like a 3-line statement. And later, a jury of lay people that are similar to board members, determined that he was murdered by the police. We all have heard the recent local case of Officer Yeager, who's a former CPD officer now. And at least according to the news, I was reading an article saying that he was initially cleared of any improper use of force. And later he was convicted of assault and battery in a court of law. Unfortunately, we know very little what happened in that investigation. We know very little what happens in any police investigation. But I think we do know with national news and what happens locally that we cannot rely on the police to investigate their own conduct. And that should be a job of an independent investigative arm of the city through the PCRB. And I am right out of time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up is Jeff Fogel. If you'd like to get in line, please click the raise hand icon in the Zoom webinar. Jeff, you're on with council and the PCRB.
I just wanted to say that those of us who followed this, including the members of the council, are quite aware of the proposal being put forward by the Civilian Review Board. What we don't know is the opinions of any of the members of council. And it seems to me more appropriate for us to make comments after we have heard the opinions and views of those whose opinions and views we don't know. Instead of
There's
just
another comment section.
Pardon?
There's another comment section.
Okay. Then let me just mention the fact that if the National PBA had been a responsible organization, we wouldn't be here today. That's all, Brian.
Did you cut off? Oh, okay.
And one more call for any hands that want to be raised. Next up is Walt Heineke. Walt, you're on. Go ahead.
Oh, hi. Thanks, PCRB members and Mr. Mendez for the great overview. And thanks, Council, for paying attention to this issue. I just wanted to say, just talk a little bit about the history here. I went back and looked at the video of Council in 2017 when they enabled the original resolution. And several councilors were actually adamant about creating a strong, forceful PCRB that could handle these kinds of problems. After that, it seemed that Council walked back from that commitment. And I heard a lot from councilors about being afraid of being sued because there's no enabling legislation. And now we have enabling legislation. And just as a reminder, the state has opened up enabling legislation for removal of the statue, and we've walked through it. We've stepped through that door. The state has opened up enabling legislation to increase the powers of the Human Rights Commission on enforcement, and we've walked through that door. And they now have opened the door for us to have a fully enabled, strong police civilian review board. I heard a lot from counselors in the interim about being, fear of being sued. And it seems to me that the state has now enabled us to go beyond those worries. And now it's just a matter of political will. And three of you during the election campaign last time around were committed to the strong enforcement powers and investigatory powers that the initial PCRB created, and then have kind of walked it back since then. So now we have the opportunity to step through the door that the state has allowed us. And it's really going to be a matter of political will on your end. And this is the kind of thing that Charlottesville needs to do when it starts to envision what a racially equitable and racially just city is going to look like in three years. This is the kind of thing that you all need to support vehemently and get out in front of this and stop worrying about being sued and those kinds of things, because now we have enabling legislation. So I'm really hoping that you find the political will going forward to be bold about this and fully implement what the state has allowed you and how the PCRB, the current PCRB, has translated that into a new ordinance. It's really up to you now to find that political will and to be bold for the sake of Charlottesville. And lastly, this is not about any particular police chief. It's about every police chief that's going to come to Charlottesville for the next 10 years or 50 years or whatever. And so, at this point, it's about the future as well as the present. And I hope you all will think about those kinds of things when you're thinking about supporting this new ordinance. And I'm hopeful that this will be enabled by the July 1st, date that the state legislature has allowed us. So everything seems to be, the doors are open. You all just need to step through it, and I hope you do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands. All right. All right. So, and I just wanted to just make the point again, I'm trying to cut Mr. Fogel off, but we just know that the public has had a lot of thoughts and wanted to make sure there were several opportunities for them to speak, and there is an opportunity after the questions and PCRB council discussions for the public to come back on again to share their thoughts about. Okay. All right, so councilors, before the CRB responds to the city manager review and before we have the discussion, which I'm sure the questions will prompt some of the discussions. So, and I think that's a good way to go about this. So just feel free to jump in, chime in. The police chief is here. The acting city attorney is here, city manager. So everyone share thoughts. And I hope that we're open enough, even though it's never pleasant and it's not going to be pleasant until we get to some sort of agreement, but just be open and share your thoughts, share your concern, ask questions. I mean, just, we're not going to get through this if we're not open. So I just hope everyone is open. It's going to probably be some heat, associated with some of the questions, some of the answers. Just be open to that so that we can try to get something resolved. I'll open it now for counselors and questions. Are there any?
Did Vice Mayor McGowan want to go first? I don't know. She said she had hers written down.
I don't know.
I'm sorry. I'm having some difficulties with audio right now.
Okay. Can you hear us, Tina?
I can hear you, but I'm getting ready to lose my headphones.
Okay.
Okay.
Lloyd, do you want to go ahead first then?
Can you hear me? I'm messing with the headphone set here.
We can hear you.
Okay. My first question deals with, has any PCRB ever had the kind of disciplinary authority that is being sought here? I called NACOL after the statute was passed. I called NACOL back in December and I asked them there if they had any example of any civilian oversight of law enforcement board that had the kind of binding disciplinary authority, and they couldn't come up with an example of any. Anybody know of one?
If I can answer.
Sure.
Yeah, I think the closest is Chicago, in which there is the board can make a binding, can make a recommendation, which the chief of police can accept or reject, and then the board can appeal to the oversight organization can appeal to the police board, and that's about it. There are a number of examples where boards make public recommendations, and then the chief is required, if he or she does not take the recommendations, to explain publicly why. But yeah, this is new territory.
So
if I could add,
go ahead.
So in today's Washington Post, there was an article, when communities try to hold police accountable, law enforcement fights back. In that section, the city of Denver looks like a former district attorney had, I guess, faulted the police department for inadequately disciplining officers, and then he helped the public safety manager implement a new disciplinary system. Echoing Bill, I haven't seen anything myself other than that, so that could be an avenue of approach to look at for going down that particular road, is the Denver model that they've created.
So is there any place where they have effectively cut out the chief of police from the disciplinary process in serious cases?
No, and we haven't either. And in fact, the legislation doesn't cut out the police chief. The legislation requires that the board consult police chief before making and or the supervisor of the officer before making any disciplinary decision.
Okay, but it cuts the police chief out of the decision-making chain in the sense that the police chief never makes a decision.
In the case of what are called, these serious breaches, that is correct.
And so the more serious the case, the less authority the chief has. Is that correct?
Well,
under your scheme.
Well, I understand. We've discussed this within our work group as well, and my answer to this is that I think, if perhaps naively, that these consultation sessions will be respectful and productive, and I think it would be a very rare situation in which the board would impose serious discipline if the chief made well-reasoned arguments as to why that shouldn't happen.
But if the argument,
that's all I can say.
Okay, if the argument for this board is that it means we don't have to rely on the identity of the particular police chief to get to the result that you want, aren't you in effect canonizing the issue of who is making the decision? In other words, now it's a question of who council has appointed to be on this board making the decision and whether they choose to respect the chief or not.
Another way of putting it would be to say that it opens up and democratizes the process by which disciplinary decisions are made.
Okay.
I think there's also an aspect in the law, section B3 as well, where there's, it pretty plainly states after consultation. So I don't think that it's the General Assembly's attempt or intent was or is to do that. So I know that there is a trepidation with, taking the onus on our own. And this is my personal reading, I'm not speaking for the board itself. I think that after consultation is a pretty big point there.
So let me ask a more particular question. If in a
I just
serious,
I'm sorry, Lloyd, I'm just trying to follow. Were you referencing the chapter 29 of the Virginia Acts of Assembly, the special session? I'm just trying to follow what you were just B3.
Oh, yes, Mayor Walker, the House Bill 5055 that was signed, which is the 9.1-601.
Okay.
okay, so I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, let's say there's a serious incident, a police shooting, and you all deem it to be a serious incident. And as I understand it, once you, under your proposal, once you have deemed it to be a serious incident, then the police no longer investigate. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So internal affairs would not kick in. No police officer would kick in. You would have your own independent investigator doing the investigating.
That is correct.
Suppose you need, suppose you need a forensic examination. How are you going to get that?
I mean, I believe that there would be opportunity to move in that direction. Obviously, everything isn't ironed out at this point, but with regard to the processes and what the General Assembly enables, if that does become a factor. And again, this is, I mean, the intent overall is this is an administrative body. So when we're talking about getting into, forensics and that criminality aspect, I don't know that the power necessarily extends to that point. However, the overall ideal would be that as a community, as community leaders, we would work to get that information so that we can properly represent the public's interest in this particular area.
Again, part of our, one of the sections, I've forgotten which one right now, clearly states that we don't have any investigate. We have to stop our investigation if there's ongoing criminal investigation. So the crime scene investigators, the coroners, the Commonwealth attorney, we'll all do their thing. We're not going that far.
Maybe I misunderstood your draft then, because I thought that the import of what it was saying, what you were saying, was that once you all kick in, it preempts any further police investigation. Am I wrong? Am I misunderstanding you?
No, I think you have hit it on the nose. But I think if you're talking about police-involved shooting or use of force, then it's something that is liable, as in the case of Officer Yeager, to come to the attention of the Commonwealth attorney.
But how does the Commonwealth's attorney investigate?
What?
How does the Commonwealth's attorney investigate?
Well, at that point, we don't have any. He can investigate any way he wants to. I mean,
normally they investigate by asking the police to ask somebody.
At that point, it's business as usual. I mean, we don't want to be in criminal investigations under any circumstances.
Okay.
And our, again, the section. Section in our draft, section 2465 is perhaps an overly long discussion of under what circumstances the board has to defer investigation and complaint reviews. And the major time that happens is when we become aware that there's a criminal or civil matter involved.
I guess I'm foundering on the question of, if police have to stop their investigation, how is the determination that there's a criminal investigation that needs to be done? How is that determination to be arrived at? But there's a related question too, and that is, how are you going to get police officers to talk to you to answer your questions?
Well, the police have police have Garrity protection. There's
right.
Nothing, we're not taking away from that. We can't make we can't compel police to testify. We can have witnesses testify. And so, I mean, I don't think that's changed a whole lot. If a policeman wants to keep his mouth shut, he's going to keep his mouth shut, whether it's an independent investigator or an IA issue.
And I think also in application of Garrity itself, it looks at it's made under the threat of termination or primarily, the threat of termination or dismissal, which obviously the board itself wouldn't have the capacity to do. So it's, yeah.
How can you say that if you've got binding disciplinary authority, you don't have the authority to fire somebody? Who else has the authority at that point if you've got the binding disciplinary authority?
Well, first off, you have to understand that you have to leave criminal activity aside. And in criminal authority, criminal authority resides with the Commonwealth's attorney and still with the police department. In the case of serious misconduct, which may not arise to the case of, which does not rise to the height of criminality, I believe that the board would have the authority to recommend strong disciplinary action. And I think that the board would be responsive to any consultation or advice given by the chief of police or the supervising officer.
Well,
May I interject just a
sure.
sec? So I think, so we can, again, try to get to some point, and I understand like the questioning, but I think with your background, Counselor Snook, and even the police chief, and even if like the Commonwealth attorney was on here, I think those are the type of conversations that we need to figure out what those, first of all, what we're going to allow, and then what those operating procedures would look like based on what we're going to allow. I know that we could spend this whole time probably finding maybe some holes in things, but if we can maybe figure out what's missing and how we make the determination of what is possible here, that it'll maybe be a better use of the 1 hour and a half we have left.
Well, I was not going to focus any more on this line of inquiry because, frankly, I've got to sit down and look at it all in a lot more seriousness, recognizing that we have no model to follow. We are being asked to break new ground. We are being asked to create a wholly new procedure that has no precedent in Virginia and apparently has only minimal bits of precedent elsewhere in the country. And I'm trying to figure out how I want to try to resolve those issues. I have real serious problems, and I'll tell you, just to answer Mr. Heineke's issue that he raised earlier, I have no problems with a good, strong review board. I don't see this draft as creating a review board. I see this draft as creating a substitute disciplinary board, not a review of other police practices. Much of what you've asked for does qualify as a review board. For example, I am also delighted to have some of these other issues of reviewing police procedures and budgets and things like that as a review matter, as an opportunity to bring in public comment, public engagement, and so on. I have heartburn, frankly, over the taking away of substantive rights that at the moment police officers have. They have those rights through the due process clause. They have these rights through the statute. By enabling this legislation, we would be taking those rights away. And I think we have to be very careful when we do that. That's all I've got for now.
And I personally concur with that. And again, I refer back to the language itself. And this is me speaking for myself, of after consultation. I understand. Yeah. I think that the General Assembly itself has done a lot of due diligence down this road for what it has, sought for review boards across the Commonwealth. And for me, again, after consultation are two big words for me in terms of getting down this particular road. And then obviously, we have to define what serious is. I think some of the initial discussions were that it would be a limited basis, but I don't want this entire process to be tanked on that particular issue, because I think there's a lot in here that is substantive for the community as a whole.
Yeah, two points here. One is that when we send, whatever we send to the city council for further action, will have been subjected to a thorough review by our independent counsel, and with legal issues like the ones you've raised, councilors don't address. Second, the legislation does not talk about review boards. It talks about oversight. And I believe that the first thing we ought to do is change the name to the Charlottesville Civilian Police Oversight Board, because, review is such a tiny part of what needs to be done. That's just personal. I haven't haven't run that by anybody else, but I think we need to change our thinking a little bit there.
Well, and that actually fits very well with my thought, because oversight also doesn't mean management.
Yep.
That's all.
If I could just add one thought, Madam Mayor. It's important that we emphasize that if it's a criminal matter, that it's out of our hands. It goes to the Commonwealth Attorney, presumably, or someone else. We're not going to be in the weeds if there's a criminal matter. If it's a lesser matter, yes, but if it's a criminal matter, we're deferring. And I just want to make sure that point is emphasized.
But I think for me, just all the people that I know that have ever been involved in the court system, when the Commonwealth Attorney, that investigative part of that is done by the police department. And so you have the officers doing those investigations, testifying in court. So that's just part of, I guess, what we have to think through.
Right.
Even if it's a criminal case and it's in the Commonwealth Attorney's hands, that Commonwealth Attorney is going to be dependent upon the police department to do those tasks that's been, done forever. So, and that's the question. That's one of my questions in all of my notes is, so what does that mean? And I know part of this is thinking if there's a transfer of staff, but to make sure that this is supported in some way. But how does that work? So those are the type of things that we really have to get in, I think, a lot of detail about, like what's even what's possible there.
I would just say,
I want to point out one more thing, and that is that we've specifically said in our ordinance draft ordinance that in the case of a serious complaint, the Internal Affairs Division will stop investigating. Now, if there's a serious criminal investigation, that goes to the Investigations Division, right? So it's not, we're not taking taking everything away from the police. They've got a big mechanism there to investigate criminal activities, and we want that to be engaged whenever it's appropriate.
Chairman Brown, may I interject a comment while we're real quickly? It seems like we have a really, deep discussion to have on this issue. And I'll be really honest that I know that May 13th is coming up, but my timeline for me, I understand the enabling legislation exists. It's not going to change anytime soon. And if we need to have some more deep discussions about oversight, review, disciplinary policies, whatever, this draft ordinance has, I have no problems and even going beyond July 1st to enact an ordinance, because I think that someone said earlier that we as a board are putting together a model that will work 3 years from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now. And so if it takes us an extra few weeks to get, feedback that it sounds like people want to have, and maybe more community feedback as well, that, I would have no problem in even going into June or even, July before this is actually adopted. We need to do it right. And I hear a lot of conversations that people need to have about some of the really, really in-depth parts of what oversight means for a community.
And I certainly agree with that. And I think it's important that we are really managing expectations around timeline. But I think a starting point, and I think I've raised this with at least one board member in advance of the meeting, is just understanding the role that our PD has had in this process and informing. I think a lot of these questions are coming up. I feel like, our leadership and our police department could certainly weigh in with perspective. And obviously one of our speakers also acknowledged that. And so I do see that, and I'm sure it's going to get some feedback from me even mentioning that, but I've always seen this process as having to be we have to have a collaboration here on where we're going with this. And I'm concerned that that's not happening, that a lot of information, has been collaborated with our police department, because they are going to be a huge component of this moving forward. And I think that we all share a desire to have accountability in our police department, but I think that to try to do this in silos is not going to be successful.
Well, and to be clear, and Vice Chair Mendez can add to this, I think that we have put out our, where we were headed and what we were looking for, to not just, Chief Brackney, but also to Acting City Attorney Robertson as well, along the way. So we haven't, other than, line officers, no one's been, excluded, from this process. And I can, and Mr. Mendez can go ahead and add to that if he desires.
No, I think there has been attention, obviously, to get something done. But I think we have, we've reached out, and in COVID times, reaching out means sending emails and making phone calls. And we don't always connect. We do our best.
So I would just need to jump in and clarify that. I just want people to be clear on what we talk about when we say reaching out. The conversation we had was a meeting that Mr. Mendez and Chair Bellamy Brown had asked to have with me, that they initiated, asking for input on your hearing procedures, not this document, not this entire ordinance. So I want us to be clear on that, versus some meeting that I requested, but it was strictly limited to the hearing procedures. And the only other contact we really had was when the board adopted a position on wanting to change the policy of how our IA complaints were distributed. So I just want us to be clear of what that does mean when we say there was reaching out. I know we've talked about IA processes, and I'm very engaged anytime you all ask me to come to your meetings. So, but this stuff that is on the agenda items, I saw for the first time once it got posted.
Well, go ahead, Bill.
And I appreciate that, Chief Brackney. And within our discussion of that hearing procedures, we did cover some of this, again, this question of disciplinary action. Are the police being taken out? And that question was presented, and obviously your position was against that, which is understandable.
Actually, no, my position wasn't against it. My position was you can't have 3 different processes. One in which an officer is leveraging, if it goes to the PCRB and there's a complaint there, that the due process, that is the city's due process for any employee, is steps 1, 2, and 3 are being taken out. I have no input in those, that they go immediately to the PCRB, who can request a hearing. And then you have to conduct a grievance hearing. And are you positioned to do that? And if another officer is similarly situated and it doesn't go through the PCRB, who has the exact same one, they have grievance processes through the city that they can leverage steps 1, 2, and 3, and then they still can leverage beyond me to the city manager. And then discipline cannot be enacted until they've exercised their full due process. This is very different. The enabling legislation changes that. So within the organization, you could have a very different track in which due process is being denied across not only the police department, but across differently than the entire city. So I'm not, that's not what my argument was. It was a due process argument in which the city could then be positioned for liability for having 2 disciplinary processes within the agency that are different within the agency and within the city itself staff through HR. So again, language is important for all of us.
Sure, absolutely. And what I was speaking was with regard to the actual investigation itself, saying that we would conduct the independent investigations as opposed to the police department doing it. And that was what you were obviously against. And that was, and rightfully so, because based on, the parameters, that's what I was articulating. So my apologies for intertwining the disciplinary aspect.
Yeah, thank you for that. We had different discussions about investigations, almost building on Councillor Snook's question. My question was, even in administrative investigations, where you would need forensics, how are you going to get that if you were doing the full investigations and we do nothing? How do you obtain, if we believe an officer was DUI and had to send their blood to the lab? That is an administrative that doesn't necessarily, or, weren't DUI, but were drinking on the job. How do you get that? You can't give guarantee. So the officers don't have to cooperate with you. Witnesses don't have to engage with you, even if they're not police officers. So how could we create a system in which we could get our desired outcomes? Is where I've been very clear, again, on how we do this and how we walk this through.
Could I mention one other thing that I want to make sure we don't lose sight of, and that is that under the enabling legislation, part of the bill that was passed amended section 9.1-507 of the Law Enforcement Officers Procedural Guarantees Act to provide that the provisions of the Law Enforcement Officers Procedural Guarantees Act shall not apply to any law enforcement officer or law enforcement agency that serves under the authority of a locality that has established a law enforcement civilian oversight body pursuant to section 9.1-601. That's effective July 1. I don't know whether what we've got right now would constitute something that was established pursuant to 9.1-601, but I just want to make sure that it's on everybody's radar screen that if in fact that is a likely interpretation, we need to pass something, it seems to me, to figure out what we're doing there.
Yeah, and in fact, that very issue came up in the discussion we had this morning on our work group, and so we've got our legal experts working on it.
Okay, thank you.
I think, and there's an earlier discussion, and Ms. Robertson can correct me if I'm wrong, but with regard to the grievance process itself, it's my understanding that that's something that city local government would handle. But as for, with regard to 9.1-601, all of it, A through F, that's the primary focus, or that was the primary focus for the board itself, not necessarily the grievance aspect.
Yeah, and I should point out that, I'm not a lawyer, and I can't write a brief. But we've been taking the advice of the acting city attorney, our independent counsel have both reviewed our draft ordinance, and neither of them have raised the issues that Chief Bracken raised. So obviously there's something there that needs to be resolved. And, you know, we will do our best.
Well, I think some of it's just a function of like, there's obviously this level of detail we're talking through an ordinance, then I think everyone's on the same page of understanding that there's a lot of procedures that it will follow once we're in alignment on this overarching kind of guide. But that seems like the devil is certainly going to be in the details there. And I think it's going to be a pretty involved process to get to that point, which is why I'm glad that Ms. Carpenter brought up just the thought of like this timeline, you know, could become a factor. But I think that's part of the issue. Like right now, up to date, it sounds like there's certainly just been these conversations around the ordinance and this overarching kind of guidelines versus getting really into those details. And then, you know, it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg. And obviously we know that one of these things has to precede the other.
Yeah, no, I understand. And in the philosophy, you know, that we developed in consultation with the acting city attorney and with our work group was to try and keep the ordinance as brief as possible. Well, I'm not sure we've succeeded, and leave the ordinance as the vehicle for expressing the powers and duties of the board. And yes, the devil will be in the operating procedures. So where issues, you know, related to the due process and grievances will definitely, and the definition of serious, and when the board can do an investigation, all those things will need to be worked out. You are correct.
And just to piggyback off of that again, it's you know, it's really a two-step process. The first step being, you know, let's just say that, you know, all of the powers that were enacted or that were given by the General Assembly are placed on the playing field, so to speak. But nothing really happens until those operating procedures come into place. And then those operating procedures obviously have to be approved by council. And the idea was that they would, you know, be done stagnantly, because we also need the capital to be able to fund whatever those procedures are. So it's not like, oh, you know, these powers that the General Assembly has articulated are approved, and then that's, oh, you have a rogue board. Those operating procedures would be that trigger point so that we can actually move forward and do the job that the General Assembly has intended.
Yeah, some of this may be a function of pardon me if I say style, in the sense that my instinct is that I find it very hard to discuss abstract issues, or harder to discuss abstract issues because we tend to spin off into a lot of detail. And so the strategy in pulling together the ordinance was to generate something concrete that we could talk about. And so people could raise concrete objections and point to a specific section and say why they had a problem. And, you know, I guess we can be much more deliberative in pulling together the operating procedures, but we still need to produce a document that is, you know, complete and coherent, so people will know, you know, the kind of model we're proposing, and we'll see it as a whole.
No, I definitely see a strong benefit to us aligning in this overarching way first, because otherwise, if we don't give you guidance, you could be spending a tremendous amount of time on something that ultimately there may not be support for certain facets of. So I totally get that. I'm just trying to figure out how do we get this conversation to help drive that next step.
So I think if the other counselors finish their comments, any questions, I have questions, and that's actually, I went through and I made notes on each of the sections and in some of the other material. And I don't think we're going to have to go through each of those and have this discussion, like current structure allows plaintiffs to opt out. That's the, you know, we need to have a discussion about what our thoughts about that is. That something that we would, you know, vote on. So I guess, you know, if we can just get the initial questions that Counselor Payne and Counselor McGill has, any.
Well, there There's a number of questions, but I guess two that pop to mind is one, I mean, my understanding is under the state legislation, the Police Oversight Board is not FOIA exempt. And is there any clear understanding about how that might impact the ability to handle investigations, receive complaints, and if the fact that it's not FOIA exempt could create big barriers to being able to do some of those functions successfully, and if there's any way to sort of resolve that issue, or where it just may present limitations, because obviously I could see that huge deterrent for depending on the context, being willing to come forward, or people being willing to lodge a complaint and participate.
Yeah, I think your point is well taken. Hi, by the way. And again, it's something that we've discussed. And part of the answer is that there are things that are confidential by state or local law. And it's not really about FOIA. But there are other things, where FOIA is an issue. And so I think that's it's an ongoing question.
Well, and from my perspective, I think when we talk about addressing FOIA, that's also done in the procedures aspect as well, and also whenever the executive director is placed. That's, those are conversations that we've touched briefly with the acting city attorney on. And so that's not, that's something that's thought of, but it's not, as far as placing it in the ordinance itself, I don't think that that's necessarily the right place for it to go. It would be more in the procedures aspect and in conjunction with the executive director whenever he or she is put on.
And, another question that comes to mind that I think is similar to it is if under this model there would be two grievance procedures depending on someone if went through IA versus PCRB, and just whether outside this enabling legislation that will run into other state legislation or issues with employment law, which I think likewise connects to the operating procedures. And I guess just my final comment is, one of the challenges I see, which it sounds like the board is in agreement on, is not on all of this, but a lot of it does seem hard to disentangle the power from the operating procedure, because the operating procedures are where, the devil is really in the details, and that will determine how it functions, how it interacts with employment laws, other state legislation. In some of these questions, I think it's just hard for all of us to maybe know without clearly fleshed out operating procedures, which it sounds like, unless I'm wrong, the board's, understands that and is working on them, but I just find it hard to disentangle the two.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It strikes me that one of the things that we could do as we develop the operating procedures is, our approach has been to, kick around ideas in the work group, to have someone like myself draft the document, then kick it around again in the work group, and kick it around in the board. Perhaps what we should do is sort of share with the city council as we develop interim products, like an outline or cliff notes, what this is the section, so that procedural questions will raise to the top more earlier. Essentially, you'll have more warning as to what we see as important issues.
And just for clarity's sake, Councilor Payne, are you headed down the line of the ordinance and the operating procedures being presented simultaneously? Is that where your thinking is?
At least from my perspective, it seems that may be necessary, because something could be in the ordinance, and if there's no context for what the specific operating procedure are, we don't have a sense of, one, how it would actually function in reality, and two, whether what's in the ordinance is going to run into challenges in terms of other state laws or employment law, because what's outlined, it's just intimately connected to how it's going to be executed through the operating procedures. Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, I get that point, but I would like to respectfully direct you to the aspect of where the operating procedure is what triggers everything. So essentially, even the ordinance itself is just the ordinance, but until an operating procedure is put in place, nothing really happens. And then and in conjunction with that, having the money necessary to do it. I don't know, personally, from my perspective, I think from a community perspective, it would go a long way in showing the community that we're serious about, doing something in this aspect. And I come back to the disproportionate minority study, which was, done or finalized as of 2020. Going back, looking at 2014 to 2016, some of the challenges that happened there, and even as further back as 2011. So, again, I think it would be nice from a community perspective, I believe, to have an ordinance in place and have that trigger of the operating procedures come subsequent to that.
Let me just, and this is final thought, but it's just like a concrete example, like the issue of the PCRB doing an independent investigation in a serious case. I just don't see how that can be disentangled from the operating procedures of what the specific mechanisms of how the investigation will operate will be, because all those specific mechanisms are going to connect to the issues of FOIA, employment law, how you're going to be able to get evidence and conduct it. And so again, I mean, you could say, we want an independent investigation, but without the operating procedures, it's just, if that makes sense. I'm repeating myself, but I can't disentangle the two.
Okay, I mean, and that's fair. And I think that, when we're talking about, and this is, again, me personally, obviously Bill has done some work with the work group, but if we're talking about, it seems like we're stuck on the independent investigation and also the disciplinary practices, but there are other mechanisms. There are like 6 other points within the General Assembly's legislation that we could tackle, and it doesn't seem to, no one's brought up any objections to at this point. I think I understand that the entire process will take some time and some piecemeal, but I think there are substantive areas that we could really, get into and make some headway on, and really flesh out this disciplinary power and this independent investigation aspect, going forward.
And I think that that's just the most important piece that we have to, all of it is important. I think we really need to get to the discussion that the community has been having, and that now we're gone through with 2 boards, is now that this enabling legislation is here, how are we gonna, move forward? It's not my turn yet. I'll let Councilor McGill go, but I think that is where we're gonna spend the bulk of the time, unless the answer there is just no, right? And so, and that's what ultimately the community is looking for more than the answers to more than anything.
I got a comment real quick. Just listening to everybody speak, I think we need to create a list of all the potential challenges with disciplinary power, independent investigations. What are those things that we see currently with what we've proposed to this point that that may cause a problem? And what can we do then to move forward? And we may have to work with our legal team and the city attorney to kind of iron those out. This is just the first draft, right? This is the first time we've all been on a Zoom together. So we're not going to get it right the very first time. But I think if we continue to have multiple work sessions and we go back and we revise, we get the comments from the city council, then, you know, we can begin to move forward and iron out some of these, you know, maybe weak spots in the current draft.
If I could just piggyback on the mayor's comment, when I first was appointed to the board, I reached out to lots of folks in the community and ran into a tremendous amount of skepticism. You know, this is just going to be more window dressing, and is there going to be teeth in this ordinance, and are we going to be able to really impact the aspects of policing in some aspects of in some parts of the community? So I think it's important that we demonstrate that we're doing something with substance, not just more window dressing.
And I would agree. I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, I think, you know, some of the key conclusions that came out of the disproportionate minority study, there's a, you know, a disparity between race of arrestees and the seriousness of charge, with African-American defendants having more serious charges leveled. There is a disparity between the race of arrestees and the seriousness of charge, with African-American defendants having a larger number of total charges. And it goes on from there. So I think that, you know, I mean, and again, the research, the record shows this has been, you know, an inception since 2011. I think I've heard from a number of community members that, you know, policing here locally has changed from you know, the police knows everybody. They give people, you know, kids rides home. They do certain things to where that's not necessarily the case now. And I agree with, you know, Mr. Frazier that, I mean, we have to put something, you know, on the board. When I came back home, a lot of people were saying, you know, this community talks. All we do is talk, but we don't actually do anything of substance to serve the community. I think this is an option, or this is a way for us to do that. Again, we can table the independent investigatory authority and the disciplinary authority, but some of these other key highlights, I think that we can, you know, move forward with and get something done on behalf of the community.
Well, I think the community is looking for some of these deeper, you know, actions that we can take. You talk about, you know, disciplinary hearings and things like that. Do we have to have concurrent hearings? Can we have a conjoined hearing? Councilor Payne was talking about, you know, employment law and things like that. Is it outside of the box to think that perhaps there's a process that can be developed and adopted in the operating procedures that, you know, looked at resource allocations? I know that Councilor Snook has made comments in about not police issues, but just resource allocation, meaning, I think, human resources, meaning people, and, you know, costs involved in that. And is there a way to look at a model such as that? I mean, just I want to put that on the table as, you know, we're talking about what's the challenges or what have you. What could be a potential resolution to this challenge?
And obviously the focus clearly has been on the investigation piece, and you know, I understand like that. I agree that that's going to be like definitely the focus on those two areas and the disciplinary actions. But the area that I know that like it's been really challenging with COVID, that I just see the real opportunity is just fundamentally like really rebuilding trust between our law enforcement and the community. And I think that comes in a lot of different ways. And I think that we need to understand what does that look like for, like, as Chair Bellamy was saying, like getting, you know, out into the community, both this board and like this body along in unison with our police department, to kind of build those relationships that I think certainly have been fractured, and for good reason in many cases. At the same time, I just think it's a real opportunity there. I mean, I understand that the focus on, you know, the issues when there are conflicts with law enforcement, and I know the numbers, as Mr. Mendez said earlier, aren't really high, but I think where the numbers are high is these opportunities to make those connections. And I just hope that we can find an opportunity to recognize that there's some really big things that we need to address here, but at the same time, there might be some small wins that we can do without getting into all these weeds. And so I would really encourage us to take that kind of approach with the police department and this body.
No, and I agree with that, and I do want to make it clear we've done this in some of the PCRB meetings themselves. This, as Mr. Mendez has mentioned earlier, this particular ordinance, this 2019 ordinance, from an operational perspective, it does nothing for us to function as the body that we need, and it requires a lot of benevolence on behalf of Chief Brackney and the CPD to get the information that we need to be able to report out to the public. So there has been efforts on Chief Brackney's and the CPD's part to work to get that data and that information there. I think it's we need to, as you said, expand on that and to build that bridge, which is one of NACOL's philosophies in all of this.
Hi, I've got some questions.
Yeah, I think you may have to call in.
First, I know it's, can you hear me?
You're in and out. That was better.
Maybe just have your video off, Sina, while you're talking.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, basically I'm on top of my computer. So these are just, and none of my questions are supposed to be like gotcha questions, please. They really are honestly about just trying to understand things, to understand the process more, to understand what's already going on. So in the auditing function of an auditor, I guess I'm kind of interested in knowing what would that job entail? How much workload is really expected? Where does that coincide with the duty of the board? What's the information the auditor's looking at? Is there information missing currently on the city website that the board would like to see? Because there is quite a bit of information already on the police website. And so I'm curious, that's my, and I as well with Michael have a hard time with theoretical thinking. It's very difficult for me to think. I need the concreteness. I want to know, I don't want to pass an ordinance that can't be enacted. To my mind, that's kind of an empty, hollow promise. I really want to make sure that I just really want to make sure that what we're passing, we can actually figure out how to make it happen. And that this is very important to me. And I'm willing then to have it take longer or to start and maybe do a staged rollout of things. Because I do feel that we're going to be looked at across the state of Virginia in communities that are not as liberal, progressive, I don't even know what to call it, as Charlottesville, that don't have the political will to even consider this yet. So I really want to make sure we're doing this right the first time and being careful. I guess also, I'm very hesitant with making somebody go the PCRB route, especially if we can't guarantee that they have true anonymity process with FOIA and everything. I don't want to take someone's choice away from them and what makes them feel safe when they're coming forward for a complaint. This is a small city, so you can't really throw a rock without hitting somebody you know. And I just want to make sure, I think we can figure out a way that the data from those reports that the PCRB needs to get a good full picture could be provided without necessarily making somebody not have a choice.
I would like to know about this. You know, what is our current investigation process for complaints that we currently have? How is that being handled? I know this is a volunteer board with no staff assistance as far as executive director. And so that's really putting some pretty serious crimps in what people can actually do right now. But not being on the board, I am curious about, I remember seeing somewhere in the paper about there being one complaint being brought forward. And I was just wondering about what's going on with that complaint, how it's getting reported on publicly, and what the whole process is for that. How will the investigation committee be trained, especially if we're taking things out of, if we're talking about taking things, I have a lot of questions about investigation training. I mean, I was just reading through various IA reports and I didn't know what half of the designations meant without having to look them up. And I'm not a lawyer. This is why it's a whole specialized field that people spend their time in. Again, I am not saying that it can't be done. I'm just saying we need to make sure that these are the kinds of things in place. I mean, where do the independent investigators come from? I mean, what kind of criteria are we talking, like PIs? Again, that's just, please do not take any of this as criticism. I'm just trying to wrap my head around understanding some of this. And there might be people who would investigate this stuff already. I just don't know about them. And I'm just curious about that and where that comes from and what qualifications count as an investigator. I am concerned how much work is being identified for the board to handle. This is a volunteer board. As we know, like in the social services board, we've had 3 vacancies now. It's easier to get boards that are, but down the road, what if we can't even get enough people to be a quorum on the board? How does that affect this? I want to think through this future enactment, because this is really groundbreaking stuff, and it might not have to be done perfect, but it has to be done as right as we can make it. How will we, I understand that police have the ability to bring a lawyer forward with them. Does that mean that we're going to have to hire a lawyer to then represent the PCRB in this? And what field of specialty would they need to have during these investigations? I mean, during the hearings, how are they to have and of course the FOIA law piece is a big concern. And none of this is against it happening. It's just all about I can't wrap my head around the powers until I understand how the powers will be executed.
Can I start answering?
Happily. I was just figuring you were going to write them down, Bill. I wasn't.
I did, yeah, I actually did. So auditing function is in order. Auditing function is described in 2-468 of the draft. And there's a list of like 9 things that the auditor will be asked to do. Will be keeping track basically of timing and processing of ongoing completed IA and board investigations, timing and substance of communication, collaboration between the CPD and the board, timing and substance of information sharing, including disclosure of files, evidence, etc. I mean, it's a long list of things. We will argue over those, and I think that list will get shorter. But I believe that the auditor has an important role to play, and it needs to be a professional. And whether it's a one full-time LOE or a little bit less than that, I'm not sure. But one LOE wouldn't be too much. In terms of forcing people to go to the PCRB, I think the Chief Brackney very strongly shares your feelings about that. And I think the city manager asked a question as well. The feedback that we've gotten from NACOL and from people who are kind of experts in the field was that generally people are less reluctant to go to an independent investigator or an independent board than they are to go to the police, because the police have far more power to, or they believe that the police have far more power to do something bad. The other issue is that the current complaint form, you could just forget to check the box. And I don't say this is going to happen, and I don't say it will ever happen, but the guy who's taken the complaint could just say, no, you don't want to sign. So it really is important for us as a board to know about all the complaints, because that's the full story. That's about what the effect of policing is on the community. The current investigation process, we don't have a current investigation process. We only review internal investigation reports, internal affairs investigation that are appealed. We have one review request pending. We have the second draft of our hearing procedure provided to you in our agenda package, and that's the way we would be moving forward. And then after that one hearing is held, then I think that we will be overtaken by events, and we'll be moving on to a new ordinance and a new procedure. How will the investigation committee be trained? So there is a training session. There is a training section. I agree that that's very important. There is a training section in the ordinance, which is section
2-471.
2-471.
Yeah, I'm looking at it.
Yeah, and again, we're going to have an executive director and the committee working together. And so presumably the executive director is going to have a fair amount or a lot of expertise. And then it will be up to the committee to apply criteria that are defined in the operating procedures as to whether that particular complaint follows is merits an investigation. The simple answer to how investigators will be chosen is by competitive procurement. We will be in the procedures, be posting required credentials and sample scopes of work. And again, the feedback we've gotten from NACOL and from other experts is that investigators can be had, and they can be had in Central Virginia. And again, that was one of the questions asked by the city manager. How much work is the board going to do? I think that's very, very hard to quantify. I think when the executive director arrives and COVID goes away, a lot of us are going to be out beating the pavement and doing a lot of public engagement that we're not doing now. You'll note in I believe it's the last section of our draft ordinance that we've proposed, reproposed an idea that was put in the initial ordinance from the initial board for having a stipend. Now, obviously, everybody's got mixed feelings about having a stipend for a so-called volunteer board. On the other hand, if you want to have a diverse board, which includes people from disadvantaged communities, you know, if you can pay for babysitting or missed meals, that may be enough of an incentive to make the board more diverse and more responsive. So that's one way to look at it. And as for the PCRB lawyer, we already have one. She was hired, and her firm was hired 3 or 4 months ago. She's been supporting us on developing our ordinance, and the intent is that she would also help us with hearings. So yeah, that's another cost. That's another cost element in there. But yes, it's one that we have already sort of taken into account. Any more questions?
And Bill, if I could add there. So a lot of so typically the board ideally would be a governing board. Due to the fact that we haven't had an executive director, we've had to get in and roll up our sleeves to get some of the policy aspects moving forward. I think we're at a point to where the operational aspect is significantly missing, and a lot of those things will be answered by that operational aspect. I think even some of the FOIA protections might come under that operational aspect as opposed to the board itself. Currently, a review request has to be requested by the whomever the review party, whoever the incident happened to, they would have to request it in conjunction for the hearing to go forward. And once that takes place, that's when a lot of the other information would be shared with the full board. Currently, combining 2020 and 2021, we're at 27 complaints, but none of that information has been disseminated. So there's the privacy aspect right now is still intact until it comes to a point to where that review request is answered, so to speak. So nobody's information is being, lost to the public, at this point. And I would, again, speaking for me, I would fully expect that the executive director, once he or she is placed, would take over all of that and kind of answer some of those more privacy related questions.
So
Well, I don't know
wait,
whether.
so
Go ahead.
who does the hearings?
So the board would,
does the hearings,
correct. The board would
right?
do the board would do the hearings. Go ahead.
So then that's becomes FOIable, correct?
Depending on what the information is provided under those circumstances. Again, there's a public aspect of what would take place in the hearing, and then there's a private deliberative aspect for some of the more sensitive information that could take place in a closed session. And again, the acting city attorney can add more there, but that's the breakdown between handling the privacy matters versus the public matters. If someone's going to request a hearing, they're going to know that certain aspects of it are going to be out for public view. And then there are other aspects, deliberative aspects, where we get into some of the more privacy informations that would be in closed session.
So
I mean,
I would like to sort of jump in here. I do have significant concerns about the availability of exemptions for members of the public who are reporting these things or who are the people bringing forward a complaint for review. I've talked this over with Kim Rolla and Maisie Osteen. We've actually had discussions last year with Delegate Hudson and her staff, explaining sort of what current exemptions are. the current exemptions all fall under the police department's FOIA exemptions, and they protect police officers' personnel records, and they protect records of internal investigations, administrative investigations conducted by the police department. You know, so right now we don't, we cannot promise that members of the public that their personal information can be protected. So that is definitely a detail that has to be worked out. Once we start getting down in the weeds on process and procedure and that sort of thing, if there are any existing exemptions that can be taken advantage of, we can consult with the FOIA Advisory Council and that sort of thing. But right now, the identifiable exemptions all belong to records that come through the police department.
Lisa, you proposed an idea where the CRB could potentially fall up under that same protection that the Internal Affairs Office gets, or at least, you know, I guess temporarily until there's another workaround. You proposed that idea, I think, in maybe our last meeting, the last training we had.
So that was one of the just sort of discussions that I had with Ms. Rolla and with Maisie Osteen as well, is whether or not any of the existing exemptions for administrative investigations could be applied to things that the oversight board or the review board, however you land on it, might be doing. And right now, that would be a matter of interpretation. And you know, one avenue might be to ask the FOIA Advisory Council for an opinion on that as well. But again, there's under FOIA, the exemption has to be very clear in order to be available. And right now, that's a possible interpretation, but I can't tell you that it's clear on the face of FOIA, because the legislation for the oversight boards is brand new and the FOIA exemptions haven't been modified since that new legislation came into place. But it is something that is an argument to be made, but I cannot, you know, I cannot say to you or to the general public right now that there is a clear FOIA exemption that on the face of the FOIA laws would apply.
So real quick, so if somebody submits a complaint directly to the CPD and they do an internal affairs investigation, right now it sounds like, you know, my understanding is that person's information is protected, right, from FOIA.
Right.
But what we've experienced so far is the CPD has, you know, said, hey, you know, Bellamy, James, you know, hey, here's the complaints we just got. At that point, is it no longer, I mean, I would still think it's something that's been directly sent to them would still remain protected under FOIA, I would believe. Or
yeah,
does that go away upon them giving us a copy of the complaint?
No, so that's why the current ordinance was set up in a way that contains a requirement that in order for you to receive the records of the police department's investigation, the members of the civilian review board would have to sign a confidentiality agreement. So, you know, it would be protecting the exemption through an agreement with the board and making sure that the police chief remains in the decision maker's seat about when the information could or could not be disclosed publicly. And so that protection is there under the provisions of the current ordinance due to the provisions that would require the CRB to enter into a confidentiality agreement.
So quick question.
I was going to say,
Oh,
Lisa, for
sorry.
clarity, I think there's something different that James Watson is talking about. There has been no exchange of informations of police investigations. What the PCRB gets is the opt-in when someone wants to file a complaint and they get the closing letter, the acknowledgement and the complaint. They get none of the investigative. So nothing that they get is part of the investigative files. So that's very different than what James, I think you were indicating, but that is not correct. It's you get the formal complaint that the person submits, in which they acknowledge they want that sent to them. And just as a point of clarity, Mr. Mendez, we don't fill out the complaints for them. They're handed the complaints and then they read through it and decide themselves whether they do it or when it's sent, and it's sent online. It's not us talking them through it, just for clarity's sake. The second thing they get is an acknowledgement of the letter, the exact same one we send to the complainant. So they get the same one, and then the closure letter, they get that as well. So no investigative and stuff has been shared to date. And even the stuff that they get, if it was asked through by FOIA as a public board of commission, it still would be subject to the same, they would, redactions for personal identifying information that I would not necessarily be subject to because it wouldn't be released.
Yeah, and it's also important to note that there are always going to be nuances to all of these issues. So an individual who might desire to have a hearing in front of the Civilian Review Board, that individual could certainly say, I authorize everyone to talk about my information publicly. So that person can always authorize you all to speak publicly about their information, but they couldn't authorize you to speak publicly about someone else's information that's in a police administrative investigation. So the thing to remember here is right now, if someone came forward and submitted a complaint through the Civilian Review Board, if you all received a FOIA request for copies of those complaints that are submitted to you that you pass along to the police department, the piece of it submitted to you may or may not be exempt from FOIA. Once it arrives at the police department and they start their investigation, the information that's generated by their investigation would be subject to the exemption. And then keep in mind in all of this, FOIA doesn't make anything legally confidential. It just provides an optional exemption from public disclosure, and somebody has to be the designated decision maker. And so among the details that will have to eventually be worked out in your operating procedures is always going to be who gets to make the decision on things that for which there are a FOIA exemption, who gets to make the decision about whether it's disclosed publicly or not. Do you make it together? Is it the CRB in some cases, the police department in others? So even on that issue, there are all sorts of nuances that have to be resolved in the operating procedures, taking into account, what City Council and the Civilian Review Board want to accomplish in the public realm.
So again, as a lay person, I noticed that in some oversight organizations, the executive director or the director is designated as the custodian of documents. Would that have any effect on FOIAbility, do you think?
No, that's not really, that doesn't drive a FOIA exemption. It just means that that person is the person who's going to have to make sure that the records are kept and maintained and managed properly. But that doesn't really really necessarily deal with the FOIA issue of whether an exemption applies.
Yeah, thank you.
Real quick, not to be FOIA into a dead horse, but how cumbersome is it up in Richmond to, I don't know, change or expand FOIA laws now to cover police oversight boards? Now that we're kind of a new phenomenon with more power.
Isn't FOIA federal?
No. FOIA's state in terms of the records we're talking about. And as I mentioned, these are already issues that we've raised with Delegate Hudson's office as being sort of details that weren't resolved by the enabling legislation that is about to take into effect. So, I think Delegate Hudson would be sensitive to the issue, but I think what Delegate Hudson and other people are waiting to hear from Charlottesville is, as you embark upon this process, if a portion of your mission is to have certain things become a matter of public record, what they want to hear from you is, what do you want the option of being able to protect? What exemptions do you want to be able to have the choice of, whether or not to disclose? And so far, it's, we really haven't gotten to that point. And so, but the short answer is yes, that is something that could certainly be resolved two ways. One is by legislation, and then the other would be some sort of interpretation from the FOIA Advisory Council that addresses whether or not any of the existing exemptions that are out there would apply to certain types of information.
Okay. So I have, I guess, probably more questions than we have time, but I'll just start with what I think is the most, what, everyone is looking for, like just the oversight model, and just going through like the simple summary that was in that packet. What I would be interested in us kind of trying to figure out is when, so you all, I wish we could pull this up on the screen, but it says, the complaint is received by the executive director. And so I think some questions for me there is still about whether it's an opt-out or opt-in. And then I have questions about how the current process is working. What has been some challenges over the past year. And I know this past year isn't necessarily an ideal year because of COVID, but I know that there have been incidents, and if there have there been any issues on the PCRB side in receiving answers to questions regarding complaints. And so that's just a two-way question of whether the complaints all go to both bodies. What does that website, I know there was a question about there could be a website created. What does that look like? If people go on a website that then goes to, I guess, the CPD and the PCRB. And so those were the kind of questions I had around there. The discussion of whether, I don't want like the board to be able to decide by majority vote, like what is serious. I want us to be able to know in advance. I have this draft list of what's considered, criteria for defining serious. Like number 8 says violation of laws and ordinance. And I just have like which ones beside it. That just seemed really open-ended to me. So I had some questions around that. And for me, voting would require for us to be able to look at a list and say, hey, we agree on these things and works. So then you get down to the whether something is serious or not serious. And there's been a discussion today about whether, or I think Sarah Burke made the comment of whether the board should even consider just doing serious or not serious. So, but then we get down to the board initiated investigations, and IA provides evidence, stops and investigating. So when I read that on top of the other stuff, then it doesn't remove, even at that point, the police department from the investigation process. And then for the not serious, IA conducts the investigation. I think if I understood Nancy clearly, then probably what I would say would would need to happen here would be an understanding of maybe a current best practice that doesn't exist yet is what does this investigation look like where it seems that the police will still be a very much so part of the investigation and through the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, if it's a not serious, incident, what does that look like? A better just collaboration there. So is there a possibility that the operating procedure that can be created where if CPD is doing this investigation, if we're not waiting for us to talk about operating procedures, staffing, who do we bring in to, do these things? And there's a better collaboration there at that point where the PCRB isn't just informed of something, that they are brought up to speed on investigations at every step of the way. And I think that for the serious investigations, I just don't understand how they are removed from the system at this point. Not saying there's not an ideal space where they are not a part of it, but even the discussion that we had earlier about if the Commonwealth Attorney has it, that it's going to be CPD that's going to be investigating. I think something that we could do here would be where the PCRB feels left out of the investigation process and that information, I would like for us to figure out how it's a, more collaborative effort. That would be my hope here. And so then of course that changes everything else from, whether something is sustained or not sustained and what does those findings. And I think we can talk about, the police chief making, disciplinary, actions, the board being able to review that and say, this is why we don't think that is, an ideal recommendation. So I think for me, just looking at that middle part and then figuring out what falls under that at that point is probably what we are really here to talk about today.
Thanks, Mayor Walker. In terms of the opt-out, until the last 24 hours, I was pretty well committed to the idea that there shouldn't be an opt-out because it simply means that the board's not going to know what's going on. But now that these issues related to privacy and process have been brought up, I'm not 100% wedded to it anymore. I think, and perhaps the chief can expand on this, that she is having having the IT department develop an approach to share complaints that are pre-redacted, which is one way of collaborating, which I think that's very constructive.
Bill, if you want to hold on, Madam Mayor, that's already done, Bill. I think you may have missed that when I said that's already done. We already have created a brand new internal affairs email so that it is not connected to an individual. If a person submits a complaint online, it is automatically distributed to the police chief, the major, internal affairs, and the executive director. When the executive director is brought on board, whoever that is, it automatically feeds them with complete timestamps. We've also put this line, you can fill this out online. All of that is there. I guess the confusion is when we talk about the opt-in, opt-out as a matter of the board not being able to see all the complaints. I guess I've always been confused because we post every complaint that comes in. So you have the executive director who will get them once they come in, but they're on our websites and have been on our websites for the last 2.5 years. Every complaint that comes in, 2019, 2020, 2021. So the board has and can just go on the website and look into internal affairs to see every complaint that comes in. So I'm not sure what it means when you say because they don't opt in that the board can't see what's going on. I think we're being asked about the way we do it because we do it differently than anyone else in the nation, posting every single complaint online, not just the number of complaints, the actuality of the complaint, as well as a summary of it, when it came in, when it was closed, the allegations, the findings, the race and gender of the officer, race and gender of the person who made the allegation, as well as in 2021, we added corrective action. You can see it like no other across the nation. So we just merely have to find out what the board says it needs more than what it's already being provided and what's currently in the ordinance that would support their work. And I think during the conversations that I've had with Mr. Brown and Mr. Mendez, I've asked, tell me what more you would want to see from us that would inform your work. And they can speak to it, but beyond what I've already been providing, I have not been asked for anything except they want every single complaint, which I've been very clear, people should have the option to decide how they want their complaint to be heard if we're talking about empowerment and justice in a system.
And is that happening often?
Ma'am?
Is that happening often? Deciding to not send the complaint to the PCRB?
It's so far, I think we've had a total of 13 complaints this year. It's on our website. I just posted it again. And Mr. Brown could probably tell you how many we sent over for 2021. It might be 4 or 5.
Correct. And in our last meeting, we had stated April 1 because the chief had told us earlier that about the executive director, the chief, and whoever the other body is would get that synchronized reporting mechanism. And so we reported that as of April 1 in our last meeting that is in effect. As far as the complaints that are opting out, it's been about 4 or 5 for this year. There may have been maybe 2 or 3 for last year.
Okay.
Yeah, so they are making it informed. And not only do you have to check, it says, I want to send it is what the first box says. So we added that first. I want it sent to the PCRB, and then they initial it. And then I do not want it sent. We send it as a second box. So it's not even informing it subliminally that we don't want it sent to the PCRB. And we fashioned that form exactly out of Fairfax, who is one of the other 2 agencies that has it, and that the initial board brought in as the subject matter experts as doing best practices. So that is the board that we've had. So when it says that the form is confusing, I sent that to the PCRB in January, I believe it was, to say, look at our new form, and got no feedback saying that it was confusing or anything about it was inherently opaque, or that the system was opaque, or that the forms are difficult.
Yeah, so I guess to the PCRB members, and I know we have about 15 minutes, so we need to open up. May one need to commit to maybe extending the meeting by a few minutes, but for the second public comment and then close out. But I'm just wondering, what do any of you have any ideas around, like thoughts around, like what does this collaborative effort could look like? I'm just thinking of if I'm interested in this discussion from having this discussion with the chief. If now, based on the earlier discussion, the prosecutor needs to come in, if, like, in terms of the operating procedures, like if it is moved to where the board investigates only, then those resources have to be in place, and the city has to make sure that there is money allocated to make sure that those experts are are available, when things happen. And so I would want to know what that system looks like, if there is if that is the way the discussion is going to go only from the PCRB end. I would just like I would need that information to factor in. But I'm also interested in what this collaborative model would look like, where if CPD is doing the investigations, and the PCRB is involved in some way, what does that involvement look like? And where all the information can be shared, and what does that look like from a legal standpoint? And then, even if, like, the disciplinary actions is to see if there's alignment, what does the chief recommend in terms of the disciplinary power, and what would the PCRB, if you all are able to do that simultaneously, and then that becomes a part of the review process when you all are discussing the corrective actions. I'm just trying to think through how we can move us to where we want, or where some of the community wants, which is this space where a field where doesn't have a lot of trust in it, is not in charge of investigating itself. But how do we create that system? I don't think we have that system right now. And if there's a way to do it where, people are not able, if they do something wrong, able to get off because the experts that are needed to be a part of the system are not available. And then I'm guessing that most of those experts that you would bring in would also be former people of a system, maybe not just of this current system. So how do people feel about that? Like, those are just some of the thoughts that I have.
Yeah, in terms of,
Go ahead, Bill.
okay, in terms of collaboration, we, to get working effectively in concert with the police, we should first off hire an executive director. We've been waiting for quite a while for that, and someone who is charged. He's someone who's a city employee who is charged precisely with maintaining that level of communication and collaboration. And also, I think that that person should be supported by an auditor who will be a two-way conduit of information between the board and the Charlottesville Police Department. And then I think it's a matter of sort of, let's work on the operating procedures and let's do it with a goodwill.
I think there's, we're talking about, public trust in policing as, quite a bit. I think the other part of that coin is policing's trust in the CRB and what it's doing. I think we can't ignore that elephant in the room because we're only solving half of the equation. There is, to think, and these are CRBs, these are civilian review boards across the country. There has typically been a relationship of contention due to that lack of trust. And I think that has to be, ferreted out as well. We can't just look at it from the standpoint of whether the community trusts the police. We have to look at it also from the standpoint of whether there's trust from the police community in the board and what the board does as well.
When I use the word collaboration, I wasn't using it in terms of unicorns and marshmallows. I'm really that there will, you talk about that there will be tension in some of the processes that we do. It can't be overlooked. And collaboration doesn't mean, that we're, in synchronicity with everything that goes on. It just means, having a professional relationship where difficult conversations will be had, extremely difficult conversations will be had should Charlottesville suffer with incidences that are at a deeper level of concern. And I won't go, I don't want to say too much more because I think it's kind of triggering for some people to hear certain language. But that, I'm not, like I said, I just want to be clear what I meant about collaboration, that, we'll do the best that we can, or the executive director will be charged with whatever operating procedures we come up with. But, not to say that, we're going to be skipping down the primrose path.
And I hope I wasn't, because I don't think that's the case either. Even the initial comment today from the, public speaker in terms of what role does the police play in kind of creating this. I had a lot of questions in my mind, even as that discussion was happening. I think when you're talking about transforming a system, there's only so much that individuals who are currently a part of that system can maybe naturally bring to a table and part of transformation. What I think if I've seen from Chief Brackney during her time here and while we've been here is a willingness to, try to work through the questions to try to make this system more fair and just system. But I have said this publicly and I say it all the time. And even when this new board came on, I tried to make a commitment to attend the meetings, to be there, so that I thought we could have some of these much needed discussions early on. And even when I said previously that if the new board would like to adopt these older bylaws, then I will vote for that because I'm one of the people who said that. I had an expectation that we would have a conversation, the new board members, about and a full understanding. And that meeting I came to, I could have asked some questions that I knew that there wasn't answers to, but I was not going to do that, which is the same question, that I said earlier about people who have expertise and have been a part of this longer than other people, but we weren't doing that either. So I think that, if I don't know where the other counselors are in terms of being able to say tonight whether the current proposed oversight model, do we want operating procedures for this model, or by your next board meeting or by next future meeting. I mean, that's, you know, something that we can spend some time on if that is the direction. But I think I have, in terms from, I'll speak for myself, I have some questions about if this is the proposed model. Then I think we have to spend some time together talking through this model. Like, this is the first time that we're here today, but also what does the operating procedure look like? I also think that at a future, you know, my next steps would be that we have to probably have a full day meeting. When is the, you know, board available for that? I think that if the city attorney who may work at your meetings can't advise you all and us at the same time, so the other attorney probably needs to be here for that next meeting so that they can focus solely on, you know, what you all, to just make sure that the advice that's being given is like, if there's any challenges to it or whatever, like if you all ask a question, we all ask a question, you know, and the attorneys need to talk amongst themselves in front of us to talk it out. I think that those type of things are how we get to a better, you know, get to an agreement.
Mayor Walker, could I just make note of one additional thing? I'd like to note, and we've talked about this in the PCRB meetings during the process of hiring their outside counsel. The current local ordinance is extremely restrictive. It goes so far as to list like maybe 4 categories of things that their outside counsel is allowed to work on. And they're only things connected to the authority that you've already given them. And so I like very much what you just said, and I think having different attorneys involved so there can be a debate and exchange would help the process. But under the current provisions of the ordinance, it's not really allowed that the review board's attorney can even work on all of the issues the board would like them to work on in this scenario. So it's something that even if you're not ready to go forward with a full set of ordinance changes, you might want to give consideration to changing that one provision that would allow them quite a bit more support in terms of truly independent legal counsel.
No, and I know that's part of the discussion that we have to review, but I think to get us there, they should be able to, like, how can the city okay them being able to participate in discussions around creating the ordinance operating procedures and attending meetings regarding, without going through that, you know, changing the, because that's one of the things we have to have a discussion about.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They can't even, their attorney can't even do that unless you change that one ordinance provision, because it's so restrictive that, you know, general counsel doesn't fall within that. You know, their hearing procedures do, because the hearing procedures they've been working on in the interim are geared towards the authority they already have under the current ordinance. But that's what I'm saying. City Council's own current ordinance is so restrictive about what legal counsel can work on. They really don't even have the full benefit of outside legal counsel to develop the operational procedures. And I think relative to those procedures, which is where all of the really important details are, that could be really important for everyone.
So I guess that's my question. Is if we add it, like, is that something that we can vote on tonight? We're all here to say that the legal counsel that they need to develop the, to change the ordinance, develop the operating procedures, and attend future meetings, is that something that we can make a decision on? Or
no, it would actually, you'd have to amend your current ordinance but it would be just the one section in the current ordinance. And if that's something council's interested in, you know, I can bring forward just that one change to the current ordinance as quickly as possible.
Ms. Roberts.
Lisa, may I ask a question about that may be something a little sneaky here? The boards, there's a section in, there's a sentence in Board 240 in section 2-457. The board's legal counsel shall advise the board on all legal issues the board may have, certain complaints, reviews of internal affairs investigations, policy recommendations, and community forums. Now, policy recommendations is awfully broad.
No, I would say that that isn't, because it's very specifically tailored to one of the powers in the ordinance, which is for you to make policy recommendations and review policy changes. That provision is there very specifically to allow outside counsel to help you with the powers that you've been granted, not to sort of work on a broader scheme of things. It would be wonderful to just get that provision out of the way and updated so that we don't have concerns over whether there's authority to pay for the services that they're rendered that aren't on that list of power.
Mr. Robertson, go ahead, Bill.
No, I just said shut.
Mr. Robertson, just from a streamlined perspective again, and I mean, obviously this has been shot down before, but I want to bring it up again. If we're going into this aspect of expanding the legal counsel powers that are articulated in the General Assembly's bill, is it not as effective to solicit all the powers and again have that trigger point be the actual ordinance that's ferreted out later? Because essentially the powers can sit there on the books, but we can't do anything to enact them without those operating procedures. So if we're going to go in and have this one particular section to change the legal, the legal representation responsibilities, doesn't it not make sense to, get the entire thing and have the trigger point be the operating procedures?
That's for you and city council to work out.
Very well.
Hey, Lisa, quick question. Would that require a modification of their scope of work as well?
No, their scope of work simply says that the services they render have to be, consistent. Well, I need to go back and look before I answer that question.
Okay.
We did reference that particular code section, so I would need to take a look, but that would be an easy change.
All right, so just for the public that's been waiting, we can, who may not be able to stay, let's open it back up for them and then see how that section goes and then make just final comments and next steps.
Thank you, Mayor Walker. And I do want to point out to council and the board, you still have Ms. Gilmore on via telephone. On a few occasions when there's a lot of background noise and other people were presenting, I muted her phone, but just want to make sure you knew she was there and available. If you're in the audience and you'd like to address council or the board, please click the raise hand icon in the Zoom webinar. Right now we have two hands up. First is Harold Foley, who will be followed by Kate Fraley. Harold, you're on. You've got 3 minutes.
So first of all, I want to say I commend the PCRB for doing the work they're doing. The PCRB is actually riding a bike and trying to build a bike with black phones on. So I really appreciate the work you're doing. Chief Brackney, yes, you're doing a wonderful job in making it look more transparent for the police department. But I've been here 50 years. And I know that you're not going to be here for another 50 years. So what I'm saying to City Council, we have to get this right. A lot of people talk about lived experience. The reason why I'm so passionate about police accountability is when I was 19, maybe 18, Living in West Haven, I had an officer throw me on his paddy wagon, put a gun to my head, and told me he's gonna blow my head off, right? And so that was traumatizing for me for years. And so that's why I do the work that I do, because I didn't know where to go. I didn't know who to complain to. I didn't know if we could complain. So my whole thing is, how do we get the community to feel comfortable saying something without people trying to pigeonhole what we can do? Thank you. Y'all have a good night.
Thank you.
Next up is Kate Fraley, who will be followed by Rosia Parker. Kate, you're on. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm following up sort of with a question, or it is a question. So I believe that Ms. Lisa Robertson said that the FOIA did not, the lack of exemption for the FOIA for the complaint that the CPD sent to the board, the exemption from the CPD carries that complaint all the way to the board so that it can't be FOIA'd. Is that what you said, Ms. Robinson? Is she still there?
Under the current ordinance, yes, that's correct. So if there's a complaint that comes in through the police department, if there's a review to be conducted by the board under the current ordinance is required to sign a confidentiality agreement to protect that information.
Well,
so that,
yeah,
but
that's not exactly my question.
If the complaint comes in through the board itself and the board forwards that complaint to the police department, it's not necessarily protected, at least to the level of detail that came through the Civilian Review Board.
Well, I think I'm still confused. The complaint itself that arrives from the CPD to the board, when you say review, you mean if they just look at it, that's a review, or is it like a hearing review?
The review that's authorized by the current ordinance. There's a whole process in the ordinance that specifies how that would happen.
Okay. And I want to say one thing to Chief Brackney. You have said twice that I've heard you that you copied the complaint form. I know I have a bug up my, you know what, about the complaint form, but that you copied it from Fairfax. And the first time you said that, I looked it up and I couldn't find the opt-in, opt-out on their forms, either Fairfax County or Fairfax City. And tonight I did it again, and there's no opt-in, opt-out on their forms.
If you look on their auditor's forms, the ones that they're sending in, you can't find Fairfax except a simple fill-in. So go check the auditor's one. That's where it came from.
The auditor, Fairfax auditor? The
They
forms
can take,
that I looked at were online for anybody to fill out, the complaint form.
yeah, well, the way our forms are, that's where we got it.
Thank you.
And next up is Rosia Parker, followed by Don Gathers. Rosia, you're on with the council and board. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. As I'm listening, I understand that it says the human resource meaning is for a people model. So my thing with the people model, the list of challenges, not making change is not allowing us to have choices. And the choices and the challenges are not to challenge change, because this is no longer business as usual. And if we continue to follow in the same footsteps that we have been following for the last few years since the original PCRB, we're going to still stay stagnant because the city council has had opportune time, plenty of time to have investigated, did the research to find out what models would work for Charlottesville. We have gave plenty information to them. You could have talked to NACO, they could have had a meeting with NACO as well as Fairfax. As you said, Fairfax was here. The only thing that you took from Fairfax was only the complaint process. Fairfax offered so much more that was geared towards Charlottesville that we could have been looking for the model. But it seems like now that the only reason city council is willing to do something is only because the force of change is being implemented on July the 1st. But I don't understand if y'all want this to be a people model. Y'all don't seem like y'all want to even deal with the people or the community because it still seems there's no trust. It seems like y'all just have a problem with authority. Time is now, and time is for change. Nobody wants to continue to live in stagnation. The longer you live in stagnation, there's not going to ever be no trust from the community. And as a victim of 10 police officers on me as a female, from officers not being correctly trained and being abused, and I have made complaints to Charlottesville Police Department that was never taken care of. It was more of a pushback than somebody actually taking time to listen to the complaint and be willing to help the community. So I think now it's time for change. And I think if you put yourself in the people of color's place and how long the history that we have dealt with the injustice due to us, I think it's time, if you look at the world, what's going on, you got to be prepared for what is to be, not what is now, because you never know what the future may hold. Even though we have seen things, even after the trial of George Floyd, even down to my protest being denied. You know, y'all didn't even give me a right to protest on the behalf of the wrongs that was being done, of the injustice to the people of color in Charlottesville. So that one is a violation even of my constitutional right. So I still feel we should, as a community, have a right to have y'all do what y'all are supposed to do, and that's to hold y'all accountable and to make things right for us. Thank you.
Mayor Walker, next up is Don Gathers, who will be followed by Gloria Beard.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for hosting this meeting. I've heard a lot of things tonight that are somewhat troubling, and a lot of hang-ups on what appear to be nothing more than mere semantics. If we would look at the model this way, the city of Charlottesville would be the corporation. The citizens of the city should be looked at as the employees of that corporation. The police department could be looked at as management, and the CRB, your job would be to function as the union that represents those employees. I don't think that you as the representative of the citizens need to be focused on or have a high level of concern about the rights of the police. That's what police unions are for. That's what the Benevolence Association is for. I think that your focus is askew, and you need to really focus and hammer down on what it is that the citizens need, more so than what the police need. So if we can get a shift of focus, I think that we can get back to the real work, the real nature, the real seating, so to speak, of the CRB. So that's really all that I have. Again, thank you for your work and your volunteerism and your dedication.
Thank you.
We have one additional hand up. If you'd like to get in line, click the raise hand icon. Gloria Beard, you're on with City Council and the board. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, well, I really learned a little bit tonight about what's going on, because I've, being shut up in the house most of the time, I miss a whole lot because I've been having health issues too. But I wanted to make a comment about the young man, who I don't know if he's young or what, because I didn't see him, that made that comment when we first started about being, you know, letting the police be involved in what's going on in this community. Well, you know, I've been saying that since day one when I was on the original board. I don't think anybody ever didn't want them to be involved, but I always said if we had, you know, more transparency and more union, this city would be a better place, you all. I mean, really would. I'm talking about an older person on the outside looking in. There's a lot of older people like myself, they feel lost. They feel like they don't have a voice and nobody cares. They used to ask me what was going on. I can't really tell them now because I'm not on the scene like I used to be. But y'all have to get involved. At least they have to form a union. They have to, relationship with the community. These people need to hear that these policemen care. Most of them said they wouldn't even call the police if they had trouble. So and I hope people hear this. I've been saying this for a while, and I want y'all to understand this is real. Because even old as I am, I got all kinds of stuff to protect me in my house. You know, the alarm system, the thing outside, what you call it, camera. I mean, and I keep my doors locked at night. I mean, and I shouldn't have to live like this. I done worked all my life, and I don't know how many years I got left. But I want to be able to trust somebody. If I call for rescue, somebody would come and not take me to jail or throw me on the ground and break my bones worse than they already broke. So this is what I want to say, y'all. It's got to be, we have to have a relationship with our protectors. Thank you all.
Thank you.
We've got 3 hands raised right now. Sarah Burke is up next, will be followed by Walt Heineke. Sarah, go ahead.
Hey everyone. Thanks for everybody hanging in there, and from the people watching to everybody involved. There's been a lot of really important discussion, I think. One question I just have is sort of moving forward. What I liked Mayor Walker's ideas of kind of like a full day work session, and I liked the ideas by Mayor Walker and Ms. Robertson about changing the ordinance, which will, take 2 readings to get that legal counsel to be able to expand her role. So I'm just wondering, like, if somebody is delegated right now with the role of figuring out how this is actually procedurally going to go forward with your 2 groups, because there have been a lot of really important questions asked. And I think that legal counsel from different, who are sort of supporting different folks and representing different folks, will have different answers to some of the questions that you have asked. And that should all get hashed out in a public space where the community can be involved, but in a way that, is both cautious and conscientious of the timeline that you all want to meet, and not, just zooming through that. I also just want to sort of highlight the importance of the auditor role and thinking about that in terms of reviewing of complaints, and not just as an individual complaint, but more sort of proactively looking at how the system works. Like right now, under the current ordinance, there's no capacity for the board to even look at complaints that ended up sustained where there was discipline imposed. So there's what is available is what Chief Brackney alluded to on the website. I went and looked at it while we were talking about it, and it is significantly more than used to be available, and I'm really grateful for that. At the same time, like the very first case that pops up in the recent posting is summarized as complainant alleged officer violated his constitutional rights by enforcing Salvation Army's request he leave the premises. And that's obviously the summary that was made by the police department in their investigation of the complaint. It's not the complaint itself. It's not the allegations that the complainant made or that the witness made who filed the complaint, and the details of it. And the ways in which the police might summarize an allegation and an incident versus the way that a community member might are different. And part of the importance of a civilian review board is to provide that view that is not just always through the lens of the police department. I'm not saying they decided that complaint wrong. I know nothing about that complaint. I just know that when I read that summary, it's clear that it is from a very specific kind of angle. And I think that that's part of the issue at play, is how much access should we be giving the PCRB so that the police are not the only creators of the content and creators of the data and creators of the documents. And then the only option is the CRB to say yes or no, that's good or bad. I think we need to be opening up the CRB's access to and involvement in policing practices. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have 2 hands raised right now. Next up is Walt Heineke, who will be followed by Teresa Hepler. Go ahead, Walt.
Thank you, and thanks, Council, for paying attention to this. I realize that you have to do your due diligence. I really do on this issue. But as you know, when it comes to the issue of race and policing in this country, the plane has crashed into the mountain. And I feel like we're doing a repeat from the last go around with the initial PCRB, where they proposed an ordinance and you all found every possible way to water it down. And these comments are starting to sound the same. And the direction's starting to sound the same. What I'm looking for is a commitment by counselors to say that the state legislature saw a specific problem and they presented a solution, and that you're committed to the solution that they presented you with by any means necessary. Because what I'm hearing now, when I hear this conversation and where that's going, I think about the phrase "the beautiful ugly Charlottesville," and what it reminds me of is that when institutional racism works, it works like this. Things get bureaucratized, they get picked apart, and finally the means become more important than the ends. And that's what I see going on tonight. And I would like you to reframe and rethink the way that you're approaching this particular issue as a significant issue of racial justice in our community. Charlottesville should be a leader in this, not waiting around to solve every potential problem that the state, legislation might bring up. I think if you want to reinstill trust in this community, you will pass an ordinance that looks pretty much the way that the PCRB today has presented you. And yeah, there may be some negotiation and a little bit of working on the issues around the sides and all that kind of thing. But generally speaking, I think a lot of us in the community are looking for you to take leadership on this and to basically come out publicly and say that you are supportive of what the state direction has allowed us to do, and that you intend to walk through that door that's now open to you. And I hope you'll do that, because right now it doesn't sound that way to me, and it's disappointing to have to go through this all over again. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Next up is Teresa Hepler. Teresa, you've got 3 minutes. Go ahead.
Hi, yes, thank you. I'm with the Legal Aid Justice Center. And first, I just wanted to thank Bill so much for all his work on drafting that ordinance. And my comment is directed towards City Council. So far, what it sounds like I've been hearing in terms of the questions from City Council, I'm not getting a sense that the people are first and foremost in your mind. A lot of what I've heard seems to be hesitation on granting the PCRB any real power. And what I'm hearing, it sounds like it's concern about the police department and trying to get trust from the community for the police department. It's actually supposed to be about respect from the police department for the community. And I've heard in terms of these hesitation about granting the PCRB power, I'm not sure why there is fear for breaking ground. and why you should have any fear of creating real oversight of the police. People of color being followed, harassed, injured by the police are afraid. So how can you be scared to do something different? Doing the same thing has caused people to get beat up and injured and killed. So your concern should not be collaboration with the police. You have been given the opportunity to give the community power over the police department. You didn't get that opportunity because the community has trust in the police. Someone has to break new ground, and Charlottesville should seize this opportunity to be a leader. The ordinance is already trying to be respectful to the police department. But at the end of the day, the review board is an oversight board, and it must be given the power to oversee what the chief of the department is doing. You're not going to build any trust between the community and the police department if there's no power over the police by the community. Right now, it's the other way around, and there's no trust. So the PCRB needs to have power, or there won't be trust. It's not about cooperation or collaboration. This is about bringing control over the police back to the community and making sure the police are not above the law. And I would just note, especially based on Bill's presentation, in terms of the last time y'all were looking at an ordinance, it looks like the originally desired powers by the original review board were watered down. And a lot of the questions that you've been asking seems to be throwing it in their faces that they're not positioned right now to do X and Y, but you never gave them that opportunity in the first place, and they have to start somewhere. You can put them in that position to have real power. So thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to make it clear, just for me, speaking for myself, that I'm not asking for the public trust in the police department. That's something that has to be earned. It is not something that's going to be given. When I'm talking about collaboration, if we are talking about operating procedures, that is something like, if those things are in the work, I'm interested in seeing those, because we asked questions at the beginning about how does this work? What is the process? And that is important when you are voting on something. I think I said clearly that I'm interested in discussing that middle area. If the police have to be engaged in this investigative process anyway, what does that look like? If there is a proposal from the PCRB where the police is not involved, and the police, and that's what I said about the police chief being here, the Commonwealth attorney being here, I'm interested in hearing about that. Personally, what is it? So just saying that there's the legislation here is one thing, but how do we make this work? And just voting on the legislation doesn't mean that that makes it work. There are things in the current bylaws and ordinance that are not being done. And so we can, and I think it's been a very hard year. It's COVID, there's no executive director. So those are two things that are, when I'm thinking about why a new board may not have been able to get something done over the year, those are the first two thoughts that come to my mind. So we need to make sure that an executive director is hired. And you all know, some of you weren't on the board, but if you listen to my comments before, and even when the board brought the state delegates and senators here, I think that this is something that the city should be able to fund at another organization. That I think that's what was left out of the state legislation, that we can fund it and someone can create it without us having any input into it. And then that takes out of us even being able to ask, I guess, these type of questions. So I am not against anything, but I do need to know how this is going to work. And I know a lot of the questions about Chief Brackney are usually geared towards me, but I tell Chief Brackney all the time, if I'm not here, if you're not here, and that is a real thing. Like, we're not always going to be here. And so this isn't about any counselors currently here, but I think I can do here, because I can't do much. Even if she's in her position, attempting to do what, the things that she's doing, that still doesn't mean that this board isn't necessary, looking at things through a different lens. I'm not a police officer. I know how our conversation go. I challenge the police chief all the time, and there is she's been in this field. That's the lens that she's looking through. So I've never said to anybody that, oversight, I said oversight, the name shouldn't be reviewed when we were first having this discussion. So I think sometimes people may hear what they want, but I hope that we can figure out what the track is. But I don't think anybody should be asking anyone to vote on something this seriously blindly. It's not entail, it's like, what can we do to get the operating procedures done so we can know we're voting on something that works? Not don't do the operating procedures, delay something, but how do we make sure that we don't want to say that the police don't do investigations and then discover that the only people that can do these investigations are somebody with a police background. Like, that doesn't make any sense. If the Commonwealth attorney takes the case over and they use the police department to investigate, the police are still investigating. So I would want to know what is possible in terms of the PCRB even being, up to date, even if it's a general overview, signing a confidentiality agreement, even if something is going through, department. So I think that we understand why we are in this, time and space, and to be able to put something together that that works. I don't think anybody in this community is ever going to trust the police in the way that I don't trust. I can say that publicly. I question when I have needed some assistance still, even in this position. So I have never asked for anybody to trust anything, and I don't think it's about that.
I was going to say, Madam Mayor, I think the one thing that you started out with that may help set the groundwork, and something I've said repeatedly when Mr. Watson was the chair, now when Mr. Bellamy is the chair, and when I've interacted with the PCRB, is where are those small wins when we can start to be successful, to build a system that we can keep scaffolding in and building on to be successful. And one of the ways that I've suggested is that there are current powers that the PCRB has. Let's start building on those, building out the operating systems for the current powers, and then how do we scaffold in or build in the possible enabling legislation? And what I mean by that is, one of the first powers that the PCRB does currently have is the ability to take in complaints. So do we have a firm, clear process, operating procedure by which we do that? And is it publicized? One of the opportunities they have is to have these reviews. As Mr. Bellamy or Chair Bellamy has said, since they've been seated, they've had one request in their time, almost a year, to have a review. And do we have the operating procedures for something like that already in place as well? And then what are the ways in which we are going to do community outreach? The pandemic and no executive director, these things do not limit us from how we might engage the community to talk about these very important issues. There are community groups across the nation and across the world who are hosting forums. Is there a way we could do that so that we could be successful and hear from the broad community who may not have access? So at least the conversations I've had, and I've submitted models too, and I think you just disappeared from my screen, Mr. Mendez. What does a cooperative model look like in San Antonio? Which you have a person who's identified to do or sit in and be part of investigations. So all of that I've provided. Counselor Hill can speak to when we provided all that for the initial board, if you remember, model after model, and what does it look like to have a collaborative model or just a collaborative model around these issues. I think it can be done. It just has to be done thoughtfully so that, as you and I have had in many of our conversations, that whatever systems we put in place, somebody doesn't roll those back regardless of who's sitting in those seats. And that's all I've asked for, even when I saw the request for the models. Can the model be successful? And if it can't be successful, we do ourselves more harm by putting in something that, as I think Councilor McGill said, that we'll never be able to bring to fruition.
But I think that's part of what we have to do is figure out, like, get on the same page, even with the legislation. I think instead of building up to it, which you kind of have to have like these grand ideas, and then you have to make those grand ideas come to life, right? And so this is if we're talking about disciplinary powers, the legislation is there for it. How do we get there? How do we get there to make sure that, like, citizens feel empowered the way they feel, that we're not talking about trusting a system that has consistently failed people, and maybe that changes and that is good, you know, but I don't think that's the point. And I don't think we can spend time asking people to understand the system, but I think it's fair to say, how do we make sure this works well? And even if we are saying, okay, we approve some of the things, you know, we approve things that are in here, that then if the delay is making sure there's agreement on operating procedures before, then that came up earlier, then that's, you know, I think we need to be able to work out to make sure that it's even possible, you know, to do these things.
And Madam Mayor, if I can be clear about the board itself, these powers, the 2019 ordinance does nothing for the board operationally. We have to rely heavily on the benevolence of the Charlottesville Police Department. So the going through and trying to do our job effectively, we would not be able to do our job were it not for Chief Brackney and the CPD providing us the information. And just to be clear on that, it's just not effective.
No, I'm not saying they are.
Understood. Just to clarify for the public's sake.
Okay.
Yeah, another point of clarification. On a couple of occasions, the chief has pointed us to models that she has thought would be very good, and in both cases they were purely advisory. They were, you know, not anything like the powers granted under the current legislation passed by the General Assembly. We've done a lot of research on models, on investigative models, on oversight models, on auditing models, on review models, and there are so many precedents for these models that work that it's a little bit disingenuous to suggest that that they can't.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the very initial comment when the discussion was going with Councilor Smith. This doesn't exist now. So even if we can throw out models and take bits and pieces or say why we shouldn't do something or should do something, we are really doing this from scratch. And, you know, so there's not anything that we can point to other than as examples for maybe parts of something.
Well, and to the question of next steps, I would agree with what was said earlier of the need for additional meetings and, if possible, being able to include the legal counsel that the PCRB currently has in amending that ordinance. Because I think there's a path forward, but at least for me and as other counselors said, I mean, there's a lot of questions and details that need to be worked out. Even tonight, just the question of FOIA has resulted in some changes of possible changes of interpretations from the board. Although I don't want to speak for the board, but I mean, clearly that was a relevant point that's related to recommendations. And I think there's a lot of points like that because it's a real risk that if we don't do our due diligence and we don't get it right, as others have said, we'll have a model that either doesn't work or that is subject to legal challenges. And we are farthest along in this process in terms of implementing the powers allowed under the new state legislation than any other locality in Virginia. Richmond has started it, but we're ahead of them. And if we don't get it right, every other locality is going to look at us. And if they haven't initiated the process, potentially abandon it. And we will also have done ourselves a tremendous disservice because it will set us back and prevent us from having perhaps any functional board. And I think that's, from what I heard tonight, I think broadly the board and council are on that same page. There's just clearly a lot more to be worked out. And to Mayor Walker's point, certainly tonight at this meeting, you know, there's not just, we don't have enough questions answered and details to be able to vote on something formally in a way that would be doing our due diligence or possible to have a successful board. And I do think we can get there. And I agree with the next steps that were proposed to have some additional meetings, perhaps definitely another work session, perhaps a longer one, again, involving counsel from the Police Civilian Review Board, perhaps other stakeholders, and just continue to move it forward in that way. So I definitely don't want to see it stop, but there's more work to be done for sure.
I think, and I just want to check in with Ms. Gilmore I see her, it keeps lighting up to make sure she's not trying to comment.
No, I'm fine.
Okay. All right. Are there any other closing comments?
Perhaps it's, I mean, I think I'm very happy with the idea of a full day work session. And I think the full day work session should probably address both the ordinance and potential measures in the operating procedures. So that would imply that it would, you know, we won't be ready tomorrow for that, and maybe we won't be ready in a month. But 5 or 6 weeks, you know, we could pick a date to make sure everybody could be there and have you know, preparations in terms of exchanging concerns and answers to concerns. Does that sound realistic?
I think we probably will have to have multiple work sessions. I don't know if we can get through operating procedures and some of these questions in the same meeting. So maybe we should at least schedule 2 to start. I think the disciplinary powers discussion, you know, the investigation, I think that is, and other people can chime in. I think we just need to get through that first, but then we can have the discussions about, you know, the other, trying to find my, you know, the structure to, you know, receive complaints to make sure, even based on the conversation that was had tonight, is there anything, you know, more that needs to be cleared about that? And of course, we have the independent investigations. There were questions around whether hearing was the right word to use. And then, you know, so moving on through like subpoena of documents, like what does that, you know, what does that, so all of that can come through the conversation without the, about the, you know, the disciplinary powers. I think we need to get to that question, look with that model, and if that is all the operating procedures, if that section is the section that's presented at the same time during that discussion, I think that's probably a great starting point to see if we can get that cleared up.
I also think
Yeah,
just
so, go ahead.
I
Sorry.
would say the path between now and when we convene and what stakeholders that are engaged in that process, I think is also vitally important so that we're coming kind of to the table with, you know, a same set of music, we're playing from the same sheet of music. I'm not saying we're all going to agree, but I do think that that has been an issue, and I raised it earlier, just not, you know, not knowing that there really wasn't a lot of collaboration done with, you know, the police department and this process. I think they're just going to have to inform a lot of this thought along the way. And so just to have them at the table and representation at the table, I think is going to be important for us to be able to make that progress.
And I think it may be ideal way that we might be looking at this, but what I think is, you know, the PCRB, they're going to have, and the public members that are helping with that, they're going to have to draft those things. And then we're just going to have a very open discussion. Unless something has shifted, you know, the input that's, you know, allowed, you know, it hasn't really gone well. Even there was a, you know, like if we break off and send 2 counselors to PCRB members, that hasn't necessarily been helpful. Maybe if we can, you know, I don't know, make some of their meetings joint sessions in case they need to call on us, you know, provide opportunities until this is being resolved at our meetings. We can think through, like, you know, what that means, like kind of like we were with the strategic plan, where we always had, if something had come up that they want us to consider, they've been able to present.
Well, you know, we have, yeah, excuse me.
I
was
just
just going to say
I'm back
that
to what you said about the collaboration. Like if we may be making it mean something that we're.
As Nancy said, I'm not making it rainbows and marshmallows, like or whatever connotation. I think that there just has to be a shared seat at the table and have that debate. Because I'll be honest, like you know, we were able to have the access and talk through some of our own concerns with members of staff, including the chief, and it was just super informative for me to have more of a broader picture. And I just think it would be beneficial if those conversations are happening proactively before we all try to jump into this again for a full day's event.
Well, I mean, there's one other alternative, and that is that the next regularly scheduled board meeting is on the 13th, which is in 16 days. And, you know, Michael usually comes to our meetings, and the chief very frequently comes to our meeting. And if another board member wanted to come to that meeting, certainly the details related to the ordinance, which by that time, you know, will have been revised to address some comments, will be discussed. And then as far as I'm concerned, you know, we don't have an agenda, but as far as I'm concerned, it could be for the whole meeting. So that's one alternative.
May I need to kind of bring us back just a second. I don't think we finished public comment before we started discussing things. I believe there were some people that had their hand raised.
Well, there was
That was after we had stopped.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure. I thought we still had people sitting there.
Councilor Hill, could you, for clarification, define what you mean by collaboration? Are you talking, you know, just solely with the chief, or are you talking about with several, you know, line officers, like, just so we don't have to come back and say there wasn't enough collaboration? We want to get this, you know, nailed, you know, pretty upfront and kind of move things along.
I can't determine who within the PD would be the best. I think, you know, probably is more than one person. I certainly would leave it up to the chief to determine, but I just think that in addition to, obviously we had, you know, some speakers that came in and spoke to just those who represent officers in a different capacity. I just think it's worth engaging in a dialogue to understand some of the hurdles that they may identify that you aren't aware of. I mean, a lot of the stuff that came up tonight is just an awareness that it's hard for you to do a lot of the investigative things that you would like to do without relying on them. And so I think just clearing some of that up among you all would be super helpful for us. and just having a forum where you're hearing each other's points of view. And I just don't know that I've really seen that kind of a dialogue. I mean, Chief, do you have a thought on this?
So it is, I say all the time, if we start with what problem are we trying to solve, we can then decide who are the right people to be there and what is the vehicle that we're going to use to get us our desired outcomes. So, you know, as we started just generically talking about investigations, regardless of what those look like, administrative investigations where there's so much power and authority that I have as the chief and Manager Boyles has of one of the only two kind of people who can give garrity to force their employees to cooperate. That's information that's extremely vital and important. That if you're forming your processes, that is a tool that which you would want officers to engage in some sort of administrative process with the PCRB. They don't realize they lose a lot if they take us out of it, is what I've keep saying over and over. You know, so yeah, you need more people there beyond those, you know, trying to find a policy. The one thing that Nate Hole says over and over again is you create your system to tailor to your community to meet the needs of your community with the resources that you have to address the problems that you have. They're very clear about that. And I think there needs to be more than just receiving ends of information, because emails don't do well in terms of interpreting the full robust meaning of what someone was trying to convey. Documents like this that we get in an agenda package probably don't talk a lot about what the intent of the board was when they were forming some of this, or whoever the task force members were for this portion. I believe there does have to be much more engagement about those persons who would be involved.
I know we've got to wrap up, but my final thought would just be, at least for me, speaking for myself, it may be more helpful, at least to me, for the discussion to be around each specific power rather than separating the power from the policies and procedures, because especially for me, that investigation and disciplinary authority piece, I don't see how it's possible to have a productive conversation about that if we're separating the operating procedures from the goal of having that power. And so, at least for me right now, it seems like that may be more helpful than just purely splitting the conversation into the ordinance versus operating procedures.
I agree with that, Michael.
I do too.
I think, yeah, no, and I think one of the things that we can do for you is to go back into our caves. No, not go back into our caves, but to sit down again and start writing sections of the procedures that deal with these complex issues, and to share those with you as soon as possible with annotations describing why we have designed it that way. That will at least keep the ball rolling, you know, until we decide when we want to get together and meet again.
Yeah, and I also think it may, you know, the investigation process, and if there is not police involvement in that process, then what does that look like for the PCRB? That needs to be really clear.
Got it.
And I think the one thing we discovered tonight is that that is one thing that is particularly not clear, at least to me.
Okay.
And I will also say, figure out if this is an offer that you want to take me up on, or if so, maybe when. I'm happy to look at early drafts and to play lawyer with draftsmanship and nitpicking language. I hate being the nitpicker in public. I would much rather be the nitpicker in private.
Yeah, we need a few nitpickers. No, that'd be fine. So whatever documents we spin out in the next couple of weeks, we'll certainly share them with you.
Great, thank you.
Will we be sharing them with our council? Bill?
Well, that's problematic, I guess, according to Lisa.
Sounds like that's a problem we can solve fairly quickly, though.
And I hope that I'm really interested in having that discussion. And Mr. Bulls, if we can figure that out, because, you know, it taking 2 readings and even making sure that when we're expanding those powers, that it's, you know, that there's alignment there. I think 2 readings is just too long, especially when we were talking about, you know, getting this done. So if there's any way that they can consult with the attorney, if that can be granted in some way, without, you know, waiting for 2 readings to change the ordinance, I'm interested in that.
And you always have the ability to waive the second reading.
Okay.
I think procedures are important, but you know, this is the first time we've ever come together as a board to really talk about this new ordinance and things like that. And, you know, it sounds like we don't even know what we want to be yet. You know, I mean, we're baking, we're not done as to where we want to go, you know, with this specific task. So I find it kind of problematic to think about procedures when we don't know what we want to do, or at least I imagine by May 13th, I guess, which is our next meeting, that we'd have a better idea of what we want to do based on the hard work that this work group has been doing.
Lisa, so is that, or can you get something on our agenda for Monday for that?
I will look at that first thing tomorrow. I was just thinking that now. I think that's a possibility. So I'm going to go back and look. I don't think there's any particular advance advertisement requirements. So I think that is a possibility. But I'll look at it first thing tomorrow and let you know.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right. So are there any other closing comments? We are almost an hour. We're an hour over. Might as well say that. 8:50.
Thank you everybody for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. It's very helpful.
And a lot of great work has been done, so we don't want to take away from that. It's just this is a big lift.
Yes.
It's only our first meeting.
Everyone who has been taking their time to put.
We can't hear you, Sina.
Yeah, auto tone or something.
King's gotten better of her today.
Thanks, everyone.
Sounds like it's time to adjourn.
Adjourn.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Adjourn.